Welcome back to the start of our evening program, everyone. I have to say, and we've been hearing it from you via social media and through chat, that you've been loving the sessions so far. They've been really, really good. It's great to see so many Liberals from coast to coast to coast joining us as we lay the foundation to work together to keep building a better, stronger, and more resilient Canada. But here's the good news. There is a lot more to come. We have so many more exciting panels and keynotes for you, right, Terry?
That's absolutely right. And I have been loving the panel sessions all morning, and it's great to be back. Our next conversation is on leadership in the fight against climate change. We welcome to the stage today Laure Waridel and Stephen Guilbeault. They are two of the founders of the nonprofit Équiterre. Équiterre is a nonprofit organization based in Montreal, dedicated to promoting ecological and socially responsible choices through action, education, and research. Now, each of our panelists are well positioned to have a meaningful conversation about the contemporary state of climate change. With much of their careers focused on fair trade, ecological agriculture, energy efficiency, sustainable transportation, energy conservation, and ecological and socially just choices, this is sure to be an incredibly timely and interesting conversation. Many of us heard from Stephen last evening, but we are pleased to welcome Laure here with us today as well. In 2002, she was named Maclean Magazine's as one of the 25 Canadian personalities who are making a difference. And in 2012, she was made a member of the Order of Canada for her contributions as a writer, commentator, and social activist on environmental issues, notably as co-founder of Équiterre. So please, everyone, welcome Laure and Stephen.
Bonjour.
Merci beaucoup, Terry. Merci. Bonjour ou rebonjour à toutes et à tous et bon vendredi. Merci d'être là. Et je suis en compagnie de mon amie Laure Waridel. Bonjour, Laure.
Bonjour, Stephen. Bonjour à tous. Ça me fait vraiment très, très plaisir d'être parmi vous ce soir.
Alors, je fais ta bio rapidement. Laure, éco-sociologue. On se connaît, toi et moi, depuis longtemps. Nous avons cofondé avec 4 amis en 1993, ça ne me rajeunit pas, Équiterre, Terry en parlait tout à l'heure. T'es l'auteur de plusieurs ouvrages, Acheter c'est voter, ton dernier, je pense, La transition c'est maintenant, conseillère spéciale dans un cabinet de recours collectif, très active dans les milieux académiques et les médias. Et tu es également, et tu vas nous en parler, je pense, dans quelques minutes, tu es également membre très actif du mouvement citoyen Mère au front. Alors, tu as généreusement accepté notre invitation pour venir discuter de la question de leadership et de l'urgence climatique, et je te remercie infiniment de te prêter à cet exercice-là avec nous aujourd'hui. Alors, sans plus tarder, entrons dans le vif du sujet. Ça veut dire quoi, pour toi, Laure, l'urgence climatique?
Donc, reconnaissait que les changements climatiques constituaient une véritable menace pour la santé et la sécurité des populations. Donc, tout ça, c'est véritablement amplifié et se compte maintenant. Si on regarde juste une étude de Santé Canada qui vient d'être publiée, on parle de 15 300 décès liés à la pollution de l'air. Donc, c'est les mêmes émissions qui contribuent aussi au changement climatique. Et ça représente des coûts de 120 milliards de dollars en équivalent de 2015. Donc, c'est vraiment des enjeux, ça a des impacts qui sont colossaux. Et je dirais que cette urgence-là, avant, elle était, si on veut, au cœur...
Un peu théorique.
Oui, quelque chose d'abstrait. Puis l'image qu'on avait des changements climatiques, c'était l'ours polaire sur la banquise qui est touchante. Mais maintenant, ce qu'on voit dans le mouvement Mère au front et dans le mouvement For Our Kids, qui regroupe des parents et des mères d'un océan à l'autre, hein, juste Mère au front, c'est 5000 personnes au Québec, c'est 25 groupes. For Our Kids, c'est à peu près l'équivalent dans le reste du Canada. Donc, c'est des parents qui ne s'étaient jamais inquiétés avant des changements climatiques. Ce sont des gens qui n'étaient pas impliqués dans des organisations environnementales ou dans des groupes.
C'est pas le portrait typique du militant ou de la militante, là.
Pas du tout. Puis d'ailleurs, parmi eux, je pense à Kelly Martin, avec qui je fais des représentations, avec qui on rencontre des élus, parce que notre objectif, c'est vraiment de vous faire sentir l'urgence climatique et d'amener des politiques publiques qui soient en cohérence avec cette urgence-là et qui nous permettent donc de freiner le cours de l'histoire. Et Kelly, chaque fois que je l'entends, même si je suis sensible aux questions des changements climatiques, l'urgence, je l'entends dans sa voix et dans ce qu'elle me raconte. Elle est urgentologue à l'hôpital général pour enfants. Elle est aussi épidémiologiste. Elle voit des enfants malades tous les jours et elle témoigne de l'augmentation fulgurante du nombre d'enfants qui arrivent à l'urgence atteints de problèmes, notamment respiratoires, liés aux émissions d'énergie liées à la combustion fossile.
Et à la chaleur aussi, accablante, l'été.
Les épisodes de chaleur, et c'est des problèmes qu'elle voit maintenant, qu'elle ne voyait pas il y a 10 ans, que vous et moi, quand on était enfants et on jouait au ballon ou on courait dans la ruelle ou dans le champ, on risquait pas ces épisodes de surchauffe qui dans 50% des cas, peuvent tuer les enfants. Donc, ce qu'elle nous dit, ce qu'elle nous témoigne, c'est que les changements climatiques tuent déjà des enfants actuellement. Et ça, pour moi, là, c'est la sonnette d'alarme la plus puissante. Et c'est ce que tout le monde devrait voir et ce qui devrait résonner dans notre tête et dans notre cœur quand c'est question de changement climatique. Parce qu'il y a quelque chose qui est important pour tout le monde, qui transcende les partis politiques, les niveaux de revenus, d'éducation, les origines culturelles, religieuses et tout ça. C'est bien l'amour qu'on a pour nos enfants et le désir de les protéger. Et ce que ça veut dire aujourd'hui, en 2021, protéger nos enfants, ça veut dire réduire de manière drastique nos émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Et ça veut dire décisions politiques courageuses qui ne sont pas nécessairement populaires.
Parlons-en. Alors, j'aimerais maintenant, et on a à peu près 12 minutes, donc 4 minutes pour chacun des 3 prochains points, l'action gouvernementale et plus particulièrement de notre gouvernement. Et alors, je vais te poser 3 questions. Ce qu'on fait de bien en matière d'action climatique, ce qu'on fait de moins bien ou de mal, et troisièmement, qu'est-ce que tu penses qui pourrait être amélioré ou qui pourrait être dont on aurait besoin en matière, on en a parlé de façon un peu plus théorique, je dirais, là, mais si on essaie pour une fille de fermière comme toi, de ramener ça sur le plancher des vaches, ça ressemble à quoi un peu? Donc, premièrement, qu'est-ce que tu penses que notre gouvernement a bien fait en matière d'action climatique?
Bien, d'abord, moi, je voudrais vous féliciter pour le prix sur le carbone parce que ça, c'est vraiment une mesure qui permet d'internaliser un peu des coûts de la pollution. On sait que les coûts de la pollution des changements climatiques vont être beaucoup plus élevés que le prix actuel puis que même le prix prévu dans quelques années, mais c'est quand même déjà un début de quelque chose. Puis vous avez osé le faire courageusement en sachant qu'il allait y avoir des provinces qui allaient s'opposer. Vous avez tenu votre bout, vous êtes allé jusqu'à la Cour suprême. La Cour suprême a vraiment reconnu dans son jugement que les changements climatiques ont une menace existentielle à la vie
que ça existe
dans le monde entier. Oui.
Ce que tout le monde ne reconnaît, hélas, pas encore.
Mais... Non, oui, en effet, notamment dans certains partis politiques, mais dans la population, malheureusement, aussi. Et là, c'est pour ça qu'on a besoin de recadrer l'urgence climatique autour de quelque chose qui touche vraiment tout le monde. Et ça, je pense que la santé de nos enfants et leur avenir en est un bon exemple. Donc, la tarification carbone, pour moi, c'est vraiment chapeau. Et je pense que l'apprentissage qui s'est fait à travers ce long processus-là nous montre que ça prend du temps avant de pouvoir implémenter quelque chose. Donc, de là, l'importance de commencer rapidement et de se donner des objectifs qui sont quand même relativement rapprochés. Un autre des éléments forts, je dirais, c'est évidemment tous les investissements dans les transports publics, dans la capacité de se déplacer autrement et de s'attaquer indirectement au fameux dogme de la voiture solo, puis d'amener dans l'esprit des gens une réflexion sur quel est notre véritable besoin. Est-ce que c'est d'avoir une voiture ou c'est de se rendre du point A au point B? Évidemment, c'est de se rendre...
On a besoin de voiture ou est-ce qu'on a des besoins de déplacement? Puis c'est 2 façons d'y penser complètement différentes.
Absolument, puis ça correspond pas à toutes les réalités. Puis en région, des systèmes de covoiturage, par exemple, sont extrêmement pertinents. L'auto électrique est un moyen, si on veut, c'est sûr que c'est mieux d'aller vers autre chose, pas de voiture du tout, mais l'autopartage aussi. Donc, il y a de plus en plus de moyens innovants qui nous permettent de réduire notre dépendance à la voiture sur l'eau. Donc, toute la question des transports, des transports publics est importante. Les investissements dans une économie verte, évidemment, la réduction toutes les technologies qui permettent de réduire la consommation énergétique, puis évidemment les énergies vertes. Mais je pense qu'il y a quand même un biais général à vouloir beaucoup pousser pour des technologies vertes sans nécessairement toujours se poser la question de comment est-ce qu'on peut réduire à la source. Il n'y a pas ce réflexe-là.
C'est peut-être ça le deuxième point sur lequel j'aimerais t'amener. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait de moins bien ou de mal? Puis, il y aura le troisième point, qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait améliorer? Mais sur le deuxième, je pense que tu commençais...
Oui, je pense que c'est la cohérence, Steven, parce qu'on peut pas, d'une part, parler d'urgence climatique et dire qu'on veut s'engager dans l'accord de Paris, s'engager dans des processus internationaux, et d'autre part, acheter un pipeline qui, d'ailleurs, risque de coûter plus de 12 milliards de dollars à la population, selon une dernière étude de l'Université Fraser. Donc, même d'un point de vue strictement économique, on voit que c'est pas nécessairement un bon choix, mais d'un point de vue environnemental et changement climatique, on doit prendre des décisions qui nous éloignent des énergies fossiles. On doit se libérer de notre dépendance aux énergies fossiles de la même manière qu'un toxicomane doit se libérer de ce dont il est dépendant, même si on sait qu'en ce moment, ça répond à des besoins essentiels. Il faut donc investir dans des alternatives et réorganiser notamment nos villes, réorganiser notre économie, aller vers une économie circulaire notamment et internaliser le prix. Ça, c'est fondamental aussi. Hein? L'application du principe de pollueur-payeur, comme le prix du carbone amène, mais d'autres principes.
Ce principe-là, on pourrait l'appliquer, on l'applique au carbone, mais il pourrait être appliqué dans d'autres sphères. Puis on le fait déjà, par exemple, de plus en plus au niveau des déchets, il faut payer maintenant pour l'enfouissement. Alors, c'est pas le carbone, c'est bien, mais ça pourrait s'appliquer dans d'autres sphères aussi.
Absolument. Puis un élément fondamental, Steven, que le Parti libéral devait faire, puis il y a des discussions là-dessus au gouvernement du Canada depuis 2008, c'est de cesser les subventions aux énergies fossiles. On le sait, les derniers rapports du Energy Tracker parlent de 20,74 milliards de dollars canadiens qui sont dédiés à subventionner le secteur des énergies fossiles. Ça doit arrêter. Cet argent-là doit aller notamment à supporter, et ça, je tiens à le rappeler, on doit être solidaire des travailleurs et des travailleuses dans le secteur pétrolier. On doit les soutenir de manière le plus qu'on peut, et les communautés, oui. Donc financièrement.
Il faut organiser, parce qu'effectivement, c'est pas souvent quand on parle de transition, les gens parlent des travailleurs, puis il faut qu'ils soient au centre de ça, mais c'est des communautés, c'est des régions, parfois même des provinces, dans le cas du Canada, qui dépendent beaucoup de ça. Seamus O'Regan, tout à l'heure, sur un autre panel, disait les revenus pétroliers à Terre-Neuve sont encore proportionnellement plus importants qu'ils ne le sont en Alberta.
Donc, de là, l'importance d'accompagner les travailleurs. Et ça, je pense que d'un océan à l'autre, on est solidaire de ceux et celles qui doivent s'engager dans une transition très, très concrète dans leur métier. Et on a des solutions. S'il y a un pays qui est outillé dans le monde de toutes sortes de manières, c'est bien le Canada. Donc, je pense qu'on est capable de le faire. Il faut avoir le courage de dire, mais là, non, ça suffit, on ne va plus là-dedans. Il faut qu'à partir de maintenant, puis ça, c'est mon autre point, Steven, il faut se doter d'une loi climat qui fera en sorte qu'à partir de maintenant, toutes les décisions qu'on prenne passent le crible de leur impact sur le climat. Donc, toutes les décisions en termes d'infrastructures, de subventions, de ceci, de cela, de programmes publics, je sais que vous le faites de manière informelle sur des questions d'impact sur les femmes ou les communautés, mais il faut le formaliser dans
en fait, je pense que je dirais pas que c'est de manière informelle, là, dans le cas des femmes, dans le cas des communautés autochtones. De plus en plus, on essaie de systématiser. Je pense que c'est pas encore parfait, là, mais je comprends ce que tu dis. Ce que tu dis, c'est que vous le faites déjà pour certaines choses. Il faudrait le faire aussi pour les changements climatiques.
Et il faudrait l'établir dans le cadre d'une loi qui soit difficile à modifier par la suite par un autre gouvernement. On sait que les gouvernements succèdent et peuvent tout changer, mais il y a des choses qui changent plus facilement que d'autres. Et une fois que l'habitude est prise, que les processus sont en place, c'est beaucoup plus facile de tenir les bonnes habitudes et à ce moment-là, d'atteindre nos émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Et si vous pouviez mettre, if you could put the slide I want to show you just a few seconds because une image vaut 1000 mots, comme vous pouvez le voir sur l'image qu'il y a ici, parce que ça explique pourquoi on a besoin d'une loi climat forte. On voit que le Canada s'est engagé à plusieurs reprises dans différents accords internationaux. Il s'est doté de cibles. On le voit avec les petits points dessous. Et la courbe de nos émissions, et ça c'est un graphique qui vient du Bureau du vérificateur général du Canada, le graphique, on voit que malgré les engagements, les émissions ont continué à augmenter. Ils ont baissé un petit peu pendant la crise de 2008, mais après ça, ça a repris. Et ce qu'on voit, la ligne bleue, c'est ce vers quoi on est en train de s'en aller maintenant avec les émissions. On n'est pas sur la ligne qui descend encore parce que nos émissions ont continué d'augmenter.
Mais ça, évidemment, c'est la première fois dans l'histoire du pays que nous avons des objectifs et un plan d'action et des mesures, à la fois des mesures réglementaires. Tu parlais du prix sur le carbone tout à l'heure. L'étude que tu citais de Energy Policy Tracker nous montre que pour la première fois dans l'histoire du pays, nous investissons plus au Canada dans ce qu'on peut appeler l'économie verte, ce qu'eux appellent l'économie verte, que dans les fossiles. Et proportionnellement, on investit plus au Canada dans l'économie verte que les États-Unis, la Corée du Sud et même la Norvège, ce qui m'a surpris, moi, dans le cas de la Norvège, parce que je pensais qu'ils investissaient beaucoup plus que nous en énergie verte. Mais tu as raison, nous investissons encore dans les énergies fossiles et il y a là une incohérence et le premier ministre l'a dit, il va falloir éliminer ces subventions-là. Et ça, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec toi.
Pas juste des subventions, c'est un ensemble de décisions qui font en sorte qu'on est encore là, qu'on permet. Donc, c'est pour ça que quand on parle d'une loi climat forte, ça doit être une loi qui fasse en sorte qu'il y a des choses qu'on arrête de faire tout simplement, qui deviennent inacceptable considérant l'urgence climatique. Puis juste vous dire avant qu'on enlève le graphique, ce qu'on constate aussi en regardant un graphique comme ça, c'est que plus on continue sur la ligne bleue qui est la tendance actuelle, plus ça devient presque impossible d'atteindre les objectifs de l'accord de Paris plus bas. Donc on se rend la vie de plus en plus difficile plus on attend. Puis on peut imaginer si on avait commencé il y a longtemps, mais bon, on peut pas changer le passé, mais chose certaine, on peut changer l'avenir et c'est vraiment les décisions qu'on prend aujourd'hui qui vont être déterminantes pour l'avenir du Canada et comment le Canada va inspirer d'autres pays aussi. You can take out the slide. Thank you very much.
Donc, tu es tout à fait d'accord avec le principe d'une loi climat. Tu aimerais, si je t'entends bien, tu aimerais qu'elle aille plus loin que ce qui est prévu présentement dans le cadre du projet de loi que mon collègue, le ministre Wilkinson, a déposé.
Absolument, puis qu'elle soit déposée rapidement, parce que là...
Elle est déposée, mais...
Je veux dire que le projet est déposé, mais je veux dire, elle doit franchir des nouvelles étapes pour qu'on réussisse à... Si c'est vraiment une urgence...
Qu'il soit adopté au Parlement, oui.
Oui, puis avec les modifications, parce qu'il est là actuellement est insuffisant. Il faut quelque chose de beaucoup plus contraignant avec des cibles, un agenda aussi qui devance 2030. Mais bon, je ne vais pas rentrer dans les technicalités. Il y a un comité qui travaille là-dessus. Il y a plein de propositions qui ont été faites par des groupes environnementaux, des juristes et autres. Mais ce qui est sûr, c'est qu'il faut se donner les moyens d'atteindre nos cibles.
Je peux te dire que nous, c'est l'un de nos projets de loi prioritaires. Bon, évidemment, en tant que gouvernement minoritaire, on ne contrôle pas tous les leviers au Parlement et on a vu que certains partis, je ne veux pas faire de politique avec toi ce soir, mais ont délibérément empêché ou ralenti l'adoption. Moi, je l'ai vécu avec mon projet de loi sur la radiodiffusion, mais je t'entends bien, c'est pour toi, puis je pense pour le collectif que tu représentes aujourd'hui, ce projet de loi-là, il est prioritaire et il doit être adopté.
Absolument, de manière urgente. Et après, les mesures doivent entrer en vigueur de manière urgente aussi.
Et là, je pense qu'on va un peu inverser les rôles.
Oui, c'est ça. L'idée, ça serait que moi aussi, je puisse te poser des questions qui sont peut-être un petit peu liées à certains éléments que j'ai amenés tout à l'heure, mais j'aimerais que tu m'expliques comment ça se fait que, par exemple, ce sur quoi on s'entend si bien, comme la nécessité de cesser de subventionner le secteur des énergies fossiles, comment ça se fait qu'on n'y est pas encore arrivé?
C'est une excellente question. Je suis un politicien encore nouveau et j'apprends encore sur mon métier. Et même si je suis quelqu'un qui a fait beaucoup de militantisme et de lobbying, je me décrivais moi-même comme un lobbyiste écologiste dans mon ancienne vie, j'apprends encore à connaître les rouages de l'appareil gouvernemental. Et tout système, plus un système est complexe, plus il est gros, plus il y a une inertie dans ce système-là. Et je pense qu'on est vraiment face à... Il y a un consensus, puis on le voit, le président Biden en a parlé, il veut lui aussi les éliminer, tout comme le président Obama avant lui en avait parlé. Mais ce qu'on se rend compte, c'est que nos systèmes... Bon, je pense qu'il y a des enjeux, on en a parlé un petit peu tout à l'heure, les secteurs qui vont être beaucoup impactés par ça. Comment est-ce qu'on fait pour accompagner ces secteurs-là? Et de façon intéressante, tu sais, je pense que la pandémie nous a peut-être donné, nous a peut-être forcé la main. Comme par exemple, là, il fallait rapidement intervenir en Alberta pour aider des gens qui avaient perdu leur emploi, le prix était bas, la pandémie qui frappe. Rapidement, on déploie 1,5 milliard pour mettre des gens au travail. Pas de l'argent qui va dans les poches des entreprises. Bon, évidemment, ces gens-là travaillent pour des entreprises. C'est pas ces travailleurs du pétrole-là qu'on a mis au travail pour s'attaquer à un problème important qui est celui des puits de pétrole abandonnés. Ils travaillent pour des entreprises, ils ne travaillent pas pour le fédéral, mais c'est de l'argent qu'on a donné pour mettre des gens au travail. Et je pense que c'est peut-être avec des idées comme ça et des initiatives comme ça qu'on réussit à rendre ce concept-là de transition qui peut être un peu théorique beaucoup plus concret. Là, je pense qu'il y a des gens en Alberta qui se sont dit « Ah, OK, ça pourrait ressembler à ça. » Puis bon, des puits orphelins, il y en a beaucoup à décontaminer en Alberta, mais on a plein de mines. J'ai entendu beaucoup de Québécois dire « Ah, on sait bien les Albertains », mais au Québec, on a des mines qui ont été abandonnées puis qui sont des désastres environnementaux tout aussi catastrophiques que les puits de pétrole orphelin. Je pense qu'on n'a pas de leçon à donner à nos amis albertains là-dessus.
Mais Steven, si tu parles de la lenteur de certains processus puis de ce que la pandémie peut nous apprendre, est-ce que ce qu'on a constaté avec la pandémie aussi, c'est que quand il y avait vraiment une urgence, on était capable d'agir très, très vite, de débloquer des sommes importantes très vite, de réglementer, de collaborer, même si des fois ça se passe pas toujours aussi bien qu'on voudrait avec les provinces, mais il y a quand même quelque chose, c'est quand on réalise vraiment l'urgence. Puis là, tu parles de relance juste et verte. Quand il y a des moments comme ça, charnières, où il y a des chocs puis des crises, c'est des occasions de se remettre en question aussi puis de pouvoir revenir même sur des mauvaises décisions qui ont peut-être été prises avant parce que le contexte, il change. Fait que dans ce contexte-là, pourquoi est-ce que, par exemple, le gouvernement libéral reviendrait pas sur le projet Trans Mountain puis à dire, mais cet argent-là, on va justement le prendre pour une transition juste et verte et on va accompagner directement les travailleurs, les travailleuses, les communautés du secteur du pétrole qui souffrent en ce moment. Pourquoi est-ce que vous faites pas ça?
Ben, c'est une excellente question et je pense que la pandémie a été certainement pour nous un moment de se poser un paquet de questions sur un paquet d'enjeux. Bon, je disais tout à l'heure, je citais le rapport que tu avais cité qui montre que pour la première fois au Canada, nous investissons plus dans les énergies vertes. C'est les investissements records en transport collectif dont tu parlais, en électrification, mais aussi également dans les énergies renouvelables. dans la rénovation éco-énergétique. Alors, c'est une première et la pandémie nous a un peu forcé la main là-dessus, comme elle nous force à réfléchir à un certain nombre d'enjeux sociaux aussi. On a entendu hier soir la vice-première ministre et ministre des Finances, Mme Freeland, parler de la question des services de garde, par exemple, donc des questions plus sociales. Mais je pense qu'il y a encore une réflexion à faire sur certains des gestes qu'on a posés, des habitudes que l'on a qui sont en contradiction avec certaines de nos aspirations.
Puis, tu sais, juste un commentaire comme ça peut être très, très payant de reconnaître ses erreurs en politique puis de changer d'idée. En tout cas, on l'a vu au Québec à maintes reprises avec notre premier ministre Legault et c'est plutôt aller chercher la sympathie des électeurs. Et dans le cas d'une sortie des énergies fossiles, et si on se retirait d'un projet comme Trans Mountain, je peux vous dire qu'il est clair que il y aurait des votes en plus au Québec ou en tout cas dans le milieu.
Je pense que clairement, nous avons pris l'engagement de sortir le Canada des hydrocarbures avec la loi, le projet de loi dont on parlait tout à l'heure, C12, donc pour que le Canada soit carboneux d'ici 2050. C'est un engagement. Maintenant, je pense que tu as raison, il faut incarner ça. Il faut avoir un plan de match. Puis on a, avec le plan qui a été présenté en décembre, on a beaucoup des morceaux de ce plan de match-là. Il en manque encore peut-être quelques-uns.
Espérons qu'ils vont venir bientôt et rapidement, étant donné l'urgence, parce qu'on a besoin de vous, on a besoin de politiques qui soient vraiment à la hauteur de l'urgence climatique et de l'urgence environnementale en général. Là, on n'a pas parlé de biodiversité, mais c'est un autre enjeu qui est majeur, les effets sur la santé de la pollution en général, pas juste de ce qui est aussi lié au changement climatique. Mais tu sais, je vois que le temps file, Steven, puis tu sais, je sais, on a démarré Équiterre ensemble, puis on avait tous les deux un rêve d'un monde à la fois plus juste et plus écologique. Puis là, nos vies ont changé de toutes sortes de manières, mais moi, j'aimerais savoir, quand tu regardes l'avenir, quand tu vois où tu es maintenant dans une position de pouvoir quand même, comment tu vois 2050 et comment tu vois les décisions que tu prends aujourd'hui politiques par rapport à ce que tu souhaites pour tes enfants qui grandissent et tes petits-enfants qui vont venir un jour?
Bon, effectivement, moi, je me suis lancé en politique pour pouvoir contribuer d'une autre façon, parce que je pense que toi et moi, on l'a fait pendant 25 ans, puis que tu continues de le faire dans le mouvement écologiste, comme éco-sociologue, comme professeur. Pour moi, l'action politique, c'est la suite de mon action militante en matière de lutte au changement climatique. Et souvent, tu sais, depuis que je suis ministre du patrimoine, je rappelle aux gens que les écolos puis les artistes sont des rêveurs dans le sens le plus noble du terme, c'est-à-dire qu'on imagine le monde autrement. Qu'est-ce que pourrait être le monde? Et c'est peut-être pour ça que c'est une bonne chose d'avoir mis un écolo au ministère du patrimoine, mais ça, c'est une autre histoire. Et tu sais, au-delà des technologies, puis des investissements, puis des règlements, puis des pourcentages, je pense que ce que j'imagine, c'est un monde où c'est des communautés tissées plus serrées, où il va faire bon vivre, donc de plus en plus de verdure, où les déplacements vont être faciles. Tu sais, quand on parle, par exemple, de l'électrification et même éventuellement de l'automatisation, de la réduction du nombre de voitures sur nos routes, ben, ça veut aussi dire moins d'accidents, moins de bruit dans nos villes. Et moi, c'est ce qui m'anime beaucoup, tu sais, c'est de léguer à mes enfants comme toi, puis à des petits-enfants. Toi, t'es belle grand-maman par association. Moi, je suis pas rendue là encore, mais c'est ça que j'ai en tête.
Je pense que les décisions qui sont prises aujourd'hui, alors que la fenêtre des possibles pour renverser le cours de l'histoire puis éviter l'emballement climatique se referme, on va vraiment dépendre des décisions qui vont être prises par le Parti libéral prochainement, puis on a besoin de vous. Et
il ne nous reste que quelques secondes, Laure, et je tiens, dans ces secondes-là, te remercier beaucoup d'avoir pris du temps, de venir nous parler à nous. Il y a plus de 4000 personnes qui sont inscrites au Congrès, puis c'est important. Moi, je trouvais ça important, puis le Parti trouvait ça important qu'il puisse entendre une voix comme la tienne. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup de m'avoir donné cette opportunité, puis bon Congrès.
Thank you so very much, Laura and Stephen. Merci beaucoup. That was excellent. And this is an urgent conversation to be having, and one, frankly, that I am very proud of that we are having as a party when we look at the work that is being done by all of us. As we remain focused on every single thing that it takes for as long as it takes to keep Canadians healthy and Canadians safe, and for Canadians to feel supported. The conversation around protecting Canadians' health is one that is absolutely evergreen. Helping Canadians through this global pandemic will continue to be our top priority, and our next panel have been working tirelessly to do just that. Please join me in welcoming Anita Anand, Patty Hajdu, and Dominic LeBlanc. And we are pleased today to have Dr. Doug Eyolfson, former member of Parliament for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley, and our nominated candidate in that riding. Doug has spent the past year serving Winnipeggers as an ICU doctor, so thank you for everything that you're doing as well, Doug. With that, let's get started. Over to you. I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks a lot, Marci. So hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session on protecting Canada's healthcare system. So as Canadians, we're justifiably proud of our universal healthcare system. I've practiced medicine in Canada for over 25 years, and I'm very happy to say that that when I give a patient a diagnosis of a serious illness, I've never once been asked, how much is this going to cost me? So now we're in a historic time for our healthcare system. This COVID pandemic has placed unprecedented challenges for everyone involved in healthcare and for Canadians in general. So to discuss this, how we can protect our healthcare system, we have with us Patty Hajdu, Minister of Health, Anita Anand, Minister of Public Services and Procurement, and Dominic LeBlanc, President of the Queen's Privy Council and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. So, Ministers, thank you so much for all of your hard work during this difficult time, and thanks for joining us. So I know everyone's anxious to get going, so we'll go right to questions from our audience. Hello? Are we still on?
We are on, Doug. We are on, okay. Doug.
Great, great.
We're just waiting for the great questions coming our way.
Okay.
Well, do you want me to kick it off with a little summary on vaccines while we're waiting, Doug?
That would be perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. As everybody knows, the focus of many discussions around kitchen tables across this country is what's happening with the vaccines. When are the vaccines coming? How many are here? And I just thought I'd give you a little bit of an update in terms of our numbers. We started the quarter thinking that we would have 6 million vaccines in the country by the end of March. We exceeded that target. We have now over 10.5 million vaccines in the country. We're expecting 6 million vaccines over the course of the next month. That's April, and 7 million vaccines in the month of May. We'll close out the quarter with 44 million vaccines in the country. And then prior to the end of September, we'll have 110 million vaccines in the country. So we're in a much different situation right now. The ramp up stage is here, and millions of vaccines are coming into this country, which is great news. But as Minister Hajdu reminds us often, we cannot rely on the vaccines alone to get us out of this pandemic. We have to continue to maintain our public health measures. And I'll stop there in case Patty wants to step in or Doug has a question.
Well, maybe I can jump in, Anita, because I think it's a great news story that you're telling. But I kind of want to back it up a bit and start a little bit earlier and talk about the beginning of the pandemic. And I have to tell you, to all 4,000 people who have signed in, first of all, we see you, even though I don't literally see you. I sure wish I was seeing you in person. But we've heard your stories over the last year, and we've heard how hard you've all worked and how much you've lost and how much you've sacrificed and how much you've given, not just to this party, but to your communities, to your families, to your own regions of this country. And I thought a little bit about what I was going to say tonight and, you know, what I was going to talk to you about. And there are so many things that I could talk to you about from a policy perspective. But what I thought I would talk about, first of all, is the values that we went into trying to manage this pandemic with. And I will be eternally grateful that our country had a Liberal government, not just because I'm a Liberal, but because Liberals believe that you cannot put a price on a human life. Liberals believe that you cannot put a price on people's dreams, on people's futures, and that in fact, we have to invest not just in everybody, the middle class, but in fact, in those people who are most vulnerable in our communities. And that's what we had been doing for the 5 years prior to the pandemic, is making those investments so everybody had a fair chance to succeed. And then the pandemic came and took us all by surprise. But it was those underpinnings of values that set the tone for what we did as a government. And you should all be so proud, because you're all donors, you're all supporters, you're all campaigners that elected a Liberal government at, I think, a crucial time of our country's history. In fact, we know that the Conservatives do have a price that they can put on lives. They do have a price that they believe we should be spending, and no more than that. We heard many members of the Conservative Party over the last year and a half talk about how they wouldn't support measures that would save someone's dream, their business, their family, their loved one. And I just want to start there. I want to start with the acknowledgement that you can't do great things unless you underpin it with core values. And we decided early on we were going to go to the wall to save lives, to save our economy, to save people's businesses, and we would do whatever it takes. And I think that's a really important place to start.
All right, thank you. Now, one of the challenges that we've had regarding particularly public health measures is, of course, many of the issues are provincial responsibility, provincial and territorial responsibility. So we have 13 different governments that we're trying to get on board. So, Minister LeBlanc, could you maybe give us a few words on the challenges that you've had working, in your post in intergovernmental affairs in trying to get all the provinces on the same page as to what needs to be done on the provincial front?
Well, Doug, thank you. Thank you for the question. And more importantly, thank you for joining us. I'm very happy to see you again. You and I had the chance to serve in the caucus together. I remember your reports from the Western and Northern Caucus every week. You spoke proudly for a key part of our country, a critical region of our country. So I'm glad to see you again. And I also want to acknowledge your service, Doug, on the front lines of the pandemic. As was said, as Marci mentioned, you have returned to your profession as a frontline healthcare worker, and your insights and your service, and that of thousands and hundreds of thousands of men and women across the country like you who look after vulnerable people at a difficult time in their lives, I think deserve our recognition and our support. And I just wanted to add my voice to Patty and Anita in saluting what you do, Doug, and what so many people like you do. The question around working with provinces and territories is a very good one. You work yourself in a healthcare system in the province of Manitoba, and you're right, there are 13 jurisdictions across the country. and the Government of Canada being the 14th jurisdiction that have responsibilities for populations with respect to healthcare. And I watch Patty Hajdu, our colleague at the COVID Cabinet Committee, which I chair every week. Patty and all of our colleagues, but particularly Patty, constantly have to discuss with territorial and provincial healthcare ministers the way that we can collaborate as a national government to protect Canadians. I don't think there's anybody who is serving in a government or elected by his or her community that doesn't want to protect Canadians, to look after Canadians, as Patty described, I think, in a very compelling way a few minutes ago. But the reality that we've all had to face is the delivery of healthcare services under our Constitution is, as you said, Doug, properly a provincial jurisdiction. But the Government of Canada has a role of leadership in that context as well. And I think Patty's done a terrific job. The Prime Minister has done a terrific job with First Ministers. We've had 29 First Ministers meetings since the beginning of the pandemic. Prime Minister had the last one 2 nights ago. All of the premiers and the Prime Minister participated in a discussion of what we can do to support one another. And he says over and over again, as Patty does and all our colleagues do, what can the Government of Canada do to better support provinces and territories as we all want to support Canadians? So whether it's procuring PPE, vaccines, having surge capacity to help areas of the country that are facing significant healthcare challenges. For example, Ontario is in the middle of a very difficult third wave, as we all know. Mm-hmm. There are field hospitals, field medical facilities. The Government of Canada is setting up in Ontario this evening. They're being set up right now. So right across the country, Dr. Tam, her provincial and territorial counterparts are able to share scientific information, but also step up in terms of leading the country in respecting the scientific advice, the advice of healthcare professionals, public health authorities, and doing what we need to do to look after one another. So the Government of Canada, Doug, as Patty said, decided at the beginning to step up in an unconditional way to support Canadians, economically support them with the necessary supports in terms of healthcare capacity that we can supplement or fill gaps that provinces and territories have. And we'll continue to do that for as long as Canadians need our support. But the reality is Canadians expect governments to work together at such a critical time, and that's what we've tried to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I've been watching the news unfold from all the different provinces, and I can understand that it might be frustrating from the federal government point of view, because we've seen some governments, provincial governments, that have been very intransigent in things like lockdowns and this sort of thing, and they have different priorities or will not listen to the experts on this. So yeah, I appreciate that you've got a big and frustrating task on this. So let's get back to vaccines. Minister Hajdu, there's been some questions brought up about the whole process. The general public doesn't understand, how does this happen that, how does Canada approve a vaccine and then get the arrangement so that it comes to Canada? How can this, can we give a quick sort of, vaccines 101 for our listeners as to how we get them approved?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Doug. And I, too, want to thank you for working on the front lines and the sacrifices, no doubt, that's meant to you and your family. And we are so grateful to people serving like you across the country and know that you are with people in excruciating circumstances. So I just want to thank you very much. Let's talk about the Health Canada regulators and the freedom from political interference, because it's a political point that I think we had to make this year. I'll bring you back to rapid testing. Actually, you might have remembered a very vocal debate in the House of Commons about why it is that we weren't approving rapid tests faster. Do you remember that debate? Some of you will. And in fact, at one point, a member of the official opposition got up and actually asked the Prime Minister why he would not approve a particular rapid test. It was a real indicator about the opposition's perspective of respect for science and regulators. It was a real clue, actually, about what kinds of dangers Canadians might have been in if we'd had an opposition party that was willing to interfere with regulators. Now, fast forward to the approval of vaccines. This is why it's important that politicians don't get to mess around with regulators, because they really are independent and they have a big job to do. And science, you know, Doug, it's hard. And sometimes it takes time. Sometimes we don't have the answers all at once. And sometimes they want to check and double check the data. And that's exactly what we can count on Health Canada regulators to do. So here's what we've done to speed things up. We approved earlier on that we would be able to approve things using something called a rolling regulatory approval. Typically, when a vaccine is developed, people have to submit, the manufacturer has to submit the entire data set for the entire 3 stages of clinical trials. And not until they're complete, all those stages of clinical trials, does Health Canada take a look. And usually it can take up to a year to approve. Well, we moved things up so that pharmaceutical companies could submit data as they were collecting it. And we assigned and doubled the number of regulators available to be able to review that data. And they literally worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we had teams assigned to each vaccine. So the regulators have worked incredibly hard, but never compromised on science. And by the way, not once have I called them to say, you need to move faster, you need to approve X, Y, Z. Why does that matter? Because we want scientists to be determining whether or not a product is safe, whether it's a test, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's a medication. We need the independence. And I'll end here, Doug. They are, in fact, so well respected worldwide that the approval of Health Canada actually adds value in some cases to products that are approved in Canada, because littler countries, smaller countries, or countries without those kinds of resources can actually use Health Canada's approval as evidence of safety and have that much trust in our regulatory body. I'm very proud of the scientists that we've leaned on so heavily this year.
Thank you for that. And I think that is such an important point to make. It speaks to the beginnings of why I actually thought of transitioning from medical practice to politics, was the frustration I saw as a physician with governments, particularly our previous conservative government that was making decisions that were in direct contravention to what the scientists and the medical practitioners were saying. Of course, the big example, not related to the pandemic, but to the, we remember about supervised consumption sites for intravenous drugs, going to the Supreme Court of Canada to actually try and get that, to squash that. When that government lost, they put in a new law that put too many hoops to make it feasible. And it was actually one of the proudest moments of my 4 years when we passed a law that repealed that conservative law that was putting those barriers up. Because I believe that our government saved lives by removing those barriers to what the scientists were telling us needed to be done for vulnerable Canadians. So thank you for your work on that, and thank you for also agreeing that the politicians should not be telling the scientists what to do. So
that's been our guiding principle from the beginning, Doug, is that scientists have to have the independence, and that we have to follow the science and the research, and that it is actually got to be the baseline of how we respond to the pandemic, is making sure that we follow the science and the research, and we support our research community.
And Doug, perhaps if I can, one of the things when Mr. Harper was first elected Prime Minister, as many of us will remember, he muzzled the scientists. He wouldn't let the Government of Canada scientists speak freely about their work to the public and the media. People, I think, want to hear from these global experts, as Patty said. I remember one night when Mr. Harper's first term, I think, where he was trying to fire the nuclear safety regulator and bully by legislation some changes around nuclear, around medical isotopes, actually from Chalk River. but he was directly and politically interfering in something as important as nuclear safety from the scientific perspective. So Patty's right. I think our government, the confidence of Canadians in vaccines is essential. On discute ça souvent au Conseil des ministres, l'importance de donner confiance aux Canadiens quant au vaccin. And Canadians want to know that the best scientists have independently looked at all of this to determine what's in their health interest. And that's something that the Prime Minister has said publicly, and our government continues to say. And Patty's done a great job in safeguarding and promoting exactly that.
Thank you. And it's been kind of a running joke that, and it gets less and less funny every day when they say that, every disaster movie starts with a bunch of politicians that aren't listening to the scientists. So we do this at our peril. So Minister Anand, questions have come up regarding COVAX, and I think there's been a lot of misinformation about Canada's role in that and accessing vaccines from it. And it's been, I've had to deal with questions like that with people I bump into on the street who know that I'm, going for public office again. And I know the answers on that, but I was wondering if you could, clear the air as to what exactly Canada's role in COVAX is, and how we've accessed vaccines from that.
Oui, bien sûr, et merci beaucoup, Doug, et tout le monde pour les questions à ce sujet de COVAX. Let's be clear, we have procured up to 400 million vaccines for Canadians, but we have not lost sight of the importance of our commitment to the developing world. And part of that commitment meant that we wanted to sign up to be part of the COVAX facility. That involved two parts. The first was to contribute to the facility for developing countries. And we contributed $220 million to that part of the COVAX facility to make sure that we were supporting as a government the transition and transference of vaccine to developing countries. At the same time, we also signed up for the other part of COVAX, which was, again, a $220 million commitment that assisted in subsidizing the manufacturing of vaccine to be sent to the developing world. And at the same time, Canada could take a very limited number of vaccines and bring those vaccines to our country. The overall goal, of course, is to ensure that we are supporting the COVAX facility, to make sure that we're supporting the pooled procurement mechanism known as COVAX. Our Minister of International Development, Karina Gould, plays a leadership role in the governance of this organization. And as the Prime Minister has said a number of times, we are not safe unless everyone is safe. And so we will share excess doses that we have as a country with the developing world. And so it's really important to remember that we are sharing doses by being part of the COVAX facility, and we will continue to do our part on the multilateral global stage.
Thank you for that, and that's great to hear that explanation. It's been frustrating to hear this from particularly from our potential progressive allies who've completely misunderstood what was done, and that you will hear them. You'll hear them say, "Oh, yeah, we're stealing from developing countries," and we know that's not the case.
Doug,
and it is framed in such misleading ways from many of our opponents that it gives people the wrong message.
I couldn't agree with you more. And one of the most frustrating things for me as a minister and member of parliament is the amount of disinformation that is coming from the opposition parties with regards to vaccines and our procurements of vaccines. For example, they continue to say that we were banking on one vaccine alone from China. That is completely false. We have a diversified portfolio of vaccines, 7 vaccine contracts, and we have had that portfolio in place since the very beginning, one of the first countries to sign with Moderna and Pfizer, and the first country to sign with AstraZeneca in terms of a country not having domestic capacity for vaccines. That's just one example. There are many other examples. You cited the COVAX example. The Conservatives accused us of not buying enough deep freezes and refrigerators, when in reality we have procured hundreds and hundreds of freezers, 700 to be exact. And we will continue supplying the provinces and territories with the supplies they need, as well as the vaccines. And did I mention 2.7 billion items of PPE procured as well? So we are comprehensive in our approach to supporting les provinces, les territoires avec les fournisseurs et les produits pour la pandémie. Ça, c'est notre responsabilité. Merci.
And Doug, maybe I can just pick up on that and reiterate the point that I think Anita made, that certainly the Prime Minister has made, and that is that we are well aware that Canada will never be safe until we actually together as a global community beat back COVID-19. It is great to see our neighbors and our allies, the United States of America, reiterate their commitment to COVAX, reiterate their commitment to the WHO. Every organization across the world is going to have to join hands and work really, really hard to really stop COVID in our countries and our communities. And Canada is well aware of that. And, Minister Anand's done a great job procuring vaccines for our country, and we will be in a good position to protect Canadians and to help that global fight. That's going to be critical for us to get out of this situation. And I think that's another thing that differentiates Liberals, is that we actually know we're part of an interconnected global community. We might not always agree with every country. We might not have the same politics, but we sure know that we have a role to play as leaders in public health, as leaders in global health security, and we'll continue to play that role.
All right, thank you. Now, just to change gears a bit, a question comes up regarding, it actually is very germane to the title of today's session. We talk about protecting our healthcare system. I made a reference in my opening remarks to, how no one here has ever asked me to, how much it will cost them when I tell them they have cancer or something like that. I spent a couple of months in a hospital in New York City as a medical student, and I understood what happens with their private two-tier system and how that can be catastrophic for so many people. We've noticed, certainly throughout the time I was in government and even beforehand, there were some court challenges coming up, some provincial practices, that there seems to be in some provinces a creeping push to privatization that we know is really not in the spirit of the Canada Health Act. And certainly a lot of Canadians do get nervous about, well, what could this mean? So maybe Minister Hajdu, I can start with you. What role do you think the federal government can have in pushing back and stopping this creeping privatization that's coming into our healthcare systems?
Well, thanks very much, Doug. And I think, another little known secret about the Liberal government when we were elected is that we decided to fiercely protect the Canada Health Act and stop that degradation, if you will, something that we as Canadians hold in our heart as essentially part of what Canadian means, which is growing up in a system, for me, of healthcare that isn't determined by how much money you have, but rather what you need. And so we have actually applied penalties, financial penalties, to provinces and territories who have violated the Health Act. We vigorously defended it in court. As you know, a famous case in BC that we were holding our breath, and in fact, the courts ruled with us. And, this is really important. It's important not just because, obviously, it's part of our identity as Canadians. That's important. But actually, without health, you don't have an economy. And I think if we don't know that after COVID, then we'll never know that. And you know what? Liberals have known that for a long time. You know, it's a Liberal government that brought in healthcare. It's a Liberal government that will defend healthcare. And it's because we critically know that our country cannot prosper if people cannot live a life of health, and that we owe it to each other to take care of each other in this country. And that's the foundation, the value that our healthcare system's built on.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps, Doug, I just to add, and your question's a very good one, and Patty is right. The Canada Health Act was originally passed by a Liberal government with another Trudeau as Prime Minister. And the Liberal Party has continually stood foursquare in favor of a universally accessible world-class public healthcare system. I think we can always, and this convention, the voices that we're going to hear over the next couple of days and in the last day and a half will help, I think, define how the next generation of Liberal governments can strengthen and improve public healthcare. C'est une valeur foncièrement canadienne. Ça nous distingue de d'autres pays dans le monde. Vous l'avez très bien dit, Doug. Au Canada, on a accès à des soins de santé parce qu'on est malade, non pas parce qu'on est riche. Et d'autres pays peuvent pas dire la même chose. But we're always looking at in caucus, in the cabinet, and at conventions like this, and in Liberal meetings across the country that we desperately look forward to being able to get back to doing, to attending in person. We hear great ideas of how the national government can lead the discussion around strengthening public health care, universally accessible public health care. We can always look for ways to improve it. But as you say, Doug, we shouldn't let some conservative governments that may want to vandalize the very basic idea of a universally accessible world-class public health care system. We shouldn't let them little by little weaken something that Canadians care so deeply about.
And I might just jump in.
That's right. Thank you for that. And please.
Well, I was just going to say that to bring it back to the pandemic, our recognition of the importance of the public health care system was really manifested in the massive procurements of PPE that we undertook for frontline healthcare workers via the Public Health Agency of Canada. So in procurement, we set about immediately purchasing large quantities of N95s, gowns, gloves, surgical masks, hand sanitizer, and that was massive procurements like it's never been done before. 2.7 billion items of PPE, 1.5 of which have been delivered already. And that PPE went out to the provinces and the territories. At the same time, we were building made in Canada goods, and we now have N95 masks being produced in this country, 100 million by Medicom in Quebec. 1 million just came off the line of the new 3M plant facility in Brockville to produce N95s. And so 40% of our PPE contracts by dollar value are with Canadian manufacturers. And that's part of the good news story of this pandemic, of procurement in this pandemic. Maintenant, nous avons les fournisseurs ici au Canada qui peuvent produire le EPI ici au Canada pour tous les Canadiens. Canadiennes, ça c'est remarquable.
And I think what Anita's point, really, your point really reminds me of is that we had to move quickly and break things at the beginning. It's not easy to procure things for provinces and territories when we don't really have great systems of knowing who has what, and old systems of, a province putting it in order. We had to blow those systems up, basically, and we had to act. We had to act quickly on behalf of Canadians, regardless of province and territories, what they needed or didn't know what they needed. We just had to put those orders in. And, I remember those early days trying to, really get the system agile. And it's not easy because bureaucracies are big and they have processes and procedures. And I have to thank, all of my colleagues, because we all worked hard to basically give the confidence to the public service to move fast and break things. Think about Minister Qualtrough and the work that she did on the CERB, and was so criticized by the opposition. Don't forget that criticism, that constant criticism. Somebody might have gotten CERB who didn't deserve it. You know what? We knew that would happen. We knew that some people might get something that they didn't quote unquote deserve, although one could argue that if you worked 500 hours in a year, you deserve CERB. Those were the rules. Nonetheless, that wasn't our priority. Our priority wasn't precision. It was to save lives. It was to save Canadians' financial security. It was to make sure that healthcare workers had what they needed so they could stay safe. It was to make sure we had what we needed. And I'm proud of a team that broke those rules and moved fast and, really, really empowered our civil service to do, I think, astronomical things over the last year.
All right, thank you for that. And I think a lot of Canadians are grateful for this work that's been done. Another issue that comes up a lot, and this is where people will say, knowing me the way they do, they're going to say, "What took me so long to get around to this?"
I feel like I know where you're going.
Yeah, I think you do. Yes.
Does it start with a P, Doug? Does it start with a P?
Gee, how did you know? Exactly. And as everyone knows, it was the issue of national pharmacare was where I spent the bulk of my time working on and rallying for. We health committee spent 2 years working on that committee and understanding, why we needed it and how it could work and the tremendous cost of not having it. People don't understand that when people can't afford their medication and get sick and come into hospital, that generates about $5 billion a year in medical costs to the healthcare system. When a diabetic isn't able to take their insulin regularly and their kidneys fail and they end up on dialysis, dialysis costs $70,000 per patient per year. These kinds of numbers are thrown around when people say we can't afford it. That's my answer to people who say we can't afford it. We really can't afford not to. So I guess I'll start with Minister Hajdu. What are the steps that we've taken so far in instituting national pharmacare?
Well, thank you, Doug. And let me just back up and say, when people say we can't afford it, we can't afford to invest in Canadians, whatever topic we're talking about, I want to ask, what's the cost of doing nothing? And you just did a great rant on what the cost of doing nothing is. And, on a personal level, I learned that early on in my career. I shouldn't say early on in my career, mid-career. I was running a homeless shelter. We had some benefits, not a lot. And I had a fellow that came to me one day and he said, I need a $40 payday advance. And I didn't really like payday advances because we all know it's hard to catch up, And so I said, listen, if you don't mind telling me what it is you need the $40 for, maybe we can help as an organization. And you know what he needed? He needed treatment for his respiratory pneumonia. He was coming to work with pneumonia, and he was a cleaner, and he was too sick really to clean well or to do his job, but he couldn't take time off his job either, and he was stuck. And you know what? This is the story of Canadians. This is the story of more Canadians than we know, that people cannot afford a medication that's going to keep them alive, that's going to treat their illness. And by the way, keep them employed, keep them able to do the things that they're making money at or that they love or that they've invested in. So, we took those important steps early on around national pharmacare, and you were there for that. And I just want to thank you because you are persistent, and your constituents should know that you, with anything you've put your mind to, are like a dog with a bone, and that is a good thing to be, my friend, as a politician. And so we're taking even further steps. You know, we started off by commissioning the Hoskins report, and we got the Hoskins report, as you know, and you'll know what's in it. And Eric Hoskins recommended national universal pharmacare. When we were reelected in 2019, we didn't have much time before pandemic hit, but we started the process of standing up the Canada Health Agency. We now have an interim president of that agency, and her job is to now start that work of negotiating with provinces and territories at what a formulary would look like. What are those essential medicines that should be covered? You know, we probably won't be able to have a formulary that's 20,000 drugs, which is, you know, as you know, some insurance companies have, but we can, and there are really good examples around the world, create a formulary of the most needed and the most prescribed drugs. And that's kind of where we're at. So I'm very excited about the next steps. I know you are. I think it's something that Canadians will benefit from. And I think it'll always be hard to calculate the cost of doing nothing, but there is a huge cost.
Doug, if I can, just very briefly to add to, I think what Patty said is very significant, and your work, as she said, also needs to be saluted. We have caucus colleagues, Doug. You'll be happy to know your former colleagues and your future colleagues have very much picked up the torch and talk about and work on this issue a great deal. What's encouraging to me is that provincial leaders, provincial premiers with whom I speak, want to work with the government of Canada on a much, much broader based way to ensure that their citizens have access to the drugs they need to improve their health and to look after their health. And some of these are conservative premiers. Conservative premiers who say, you know what, if your government wants to do something significant on pharmacare, I want to be a partner. I want to sign up. Is it a pilot project? Is it a permanent program? I want to be part of it. And the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, who was recently reelected with a majority government, like you, Doug, is a physician. Dr. Fury has told us over and over again that he'll be happy to help us lead across the country the argument for working with provinces and territories and the national government on raising our game on pharmacare. So I'm very enthusiastic. And Doug, when you rejoin the caucus, you'll see the progress we've made, and you can help us drive it over the finish line.
Well, thanks for that. Minister Anand, did you have anything to add to that?
You know, I've got to say that when this issue comes up in the House of Commons, as it did recently with the NDP's motion on a vote on pharmacare, many of our constituents were concerned because we did not, as a government, vote in favor of that that initiative. And I just want to say that it was not because we, as a government, are not committed to the principles of pharmacare, but the proposal that was on the table was, in our view, unconstitutional. It wasn't respecting the division of labor set out in the Constitution Act of 1982 as between the provincial and federal governments. So the initiatives that we bring forward as a government, whether in the area of pharmacare or any other area, are going to be with the constitutional division of powers in mind. And that's exactly why, for example, in the area of responding to the pandemic, we are here for the provinces and territories every step of the way to support their efforts in addressing the local and regional issues that arise with regards to the pandemic. And from a procurement standpoint, what that means, Doug, is to continue to procure millions and millions of vaccines. 44 million will be here before the end of June. To procure PPE, as I've already mentioned, and all of the supplies necessary to administer those vaccines. We are going to be there every step of the way for the provinces with financial supports, as well as PPE and vaccine supplies, so that we as a country can emerge together from this pandemic.
Thank you for that. And that's been very helpful, and I'm very encouraged to hear, what all of you have said about this, because, that was something that one of the reasons I was disappointed not to be back last election was that not being able to participate in that process. So I'm very happy that it's still going. We're down to the last couple of minutes. So just one last question I have, and whoever can answer this briefly. Do you think that we've learned in the pandemic any lessons that can teach us that to help us to move pharmacare forward?
Well, maybe I can jump in and then turn to my colleagues. I think what we've learned through the pandemic is that every dollar we invest in vulnerable people, every dollar that we invest in affordable housing, every dollar that we invest in better, cleaner air and the environment is actually preventing future pandemics. It's actually creating stronger people. It's actually, we know, public health experts have known for a very long time that poverty and inequality actually drives illness, and nobody is safe if we've got illness running rampant in any part of our country. And, we've I think as a country, begun to move the dial since 2015. Our historic investments in housing, our historic investments in skills training, in Indigenous reconciliation, in running water, in access to healthcare, in harm reduction for substance use. Those are the kinds of things that we have to double down on, Doug. And that's why I'm proud to be a Liberal.
Thank you. And that's, and as a last note, what you say about addressing poverty, it was said by Mahatma Gandhi many years ago, poverty is very expensive. And I think in investing in that, not only do we improve the health of Canadians, we improve the lives of Canadians, and it will be better for all. So I would like to thank you all for joining me today and for sharing your message with Canadians. And I would like to thank the Liberal Party for inviting me to moderate this convention. So thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the convention.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you,
Doug.
Doug. Thanks, Dom. Thanks, Patty.
See you soon.
From Mahatma Gandhi, Doug. Good quote.
See you soon, Doug. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for that great discussion. On behalf of Canadians everywhere, I want to say a special thank you to the members of this particular panel. You have each gone above and beyond to not just take action addressing COVID, but each of you have worked so hard to listen to Canadians and make sure that the concerns of the average person in small business was reflected in our policy. Never have I seen a government move so fast or adjust so quickly in real time to the concerns of Canadians, and each of you have played a deeply personal role in delivering these results. So thank you. The next conversation is one that I know that many of you have been looking forward to. I know I've seen a lot of social media posts with people talking about our next speaker's book, pronounced value or values, depending on your focus, and the topics are, of course, related. Now, I'm known in caucus as a bit of a nerd, and I used to work for Stephen Poloz, so I wanted to give Mark a heads up that I have a future question about the lifetime carbon budgets detailed on a graph on page 267. But luckily for our audience, this question will have to wait, because tonight we are all fortunate that Marc Carney will join us in conversation with my fellow co-chair, Marci Ien. Now, Mark is an economist, banker, and author of the aforementioned book, Values, Building a Better World for All. He is vice chairman and head of impact investing at Brookfield Asset Management, and he served as the governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 until 2013, and as governor of Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. Prior to his governorships, Carney worked at Goldman Sachs, as well as the Canadian Department of Finance. With Marci's notable experience as a journalist and TV host, this conversation is sure to be enlightening for all of us. As they say in the newsroom or on the social, over to you, Marci.
Thanks so much, Terry. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And Mark, oh my goodness, as Terry mentioned, there's a lot of excitement. People are posting pictures of themselves holding up your book. They're excited for this conversation, and they should be. You are, Bank of Canada governor, former one, Bank of England governor, UN special envoy for climate action and finance, and author. And that, my friend, leads to a very interesting and diverse point of view. So cannot wait to chat with you. But before we do that, you're going to speak. You're going to say a few words. So I'm going to turn it over to you right now, and we'll talk on the other side. Can't wait.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Marci. Thank you, Terry, for that. I look forward to that discussion of the footnote on page 260 odd. I'd like to begin. I'd like to begin by acknowledging I'm speaking this evening from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be present here. And like all of you, like all of us, I'm also grateful for the exceptional service of our frontline health professionals and essential workers, and for the sacrifices of Canadians who are helping each other out every day to get through this difficult time. Now, this evening, what I wanted to do in the few minutes I have is to speak about how we get what we value: our health and security, an economy that works for all Canadians, and a sustainable future for us, our kids, and our grandkids. But before I focus on tomorrow, let me start where I began. I was born in Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories. A national park separated me from what was then known as the tar sands. And one of my earliest memories was my father showing me some bitumen and telling me of its potential to power the world. I grew up in Edmonton as scientists, governments, and entrepreneurs turned that vast resource from a concept to a reality and to prosperity. I was a teenager when Wayne Gretzky famously taught us to win by skating to where the puck's going, a lesson with value beyond hockey then and now. And I learned from my family, friends, and neighbors the values of integrity, responsibility, solidarity, and compassion. I've been fortunate to live in a country where millions of people, like you, volunteer countless hours to build an even better Canada. And from all those experiences, I've learned that progress doesn't just happen. It takes vision, hard work, and disciplined implementation. And it's only durable. Progress is only durable when it's rooted in our shared values. We move forward when we face up to our challenges, when we forge consensus on where we want to go, and then take decisive action to get there. Lorsque l'opportunité s'est présentée, j'ai agi en fonction de nos valeurs canadiennes afin d'avancer d'intérêt public. Pendant la crise financière, j'ai travaillé avec mes collègues pour protéger les Canadiens et Canadiennes qui avaient peur de perdre leur maison et qui s'inquiétaient de l'avenir de leurs entreprises et de leurs familles. Là où beaucoup de pays ont échoué, le Canada s'est tenu debout. Lorsque les leaders de G20 m'ont demandé de mener la refonte du système financier qui avait failli tant déjà, j'ai adopté l'approche canadienne. On s'est fixé des cibles ambitieuses. On a eu des débats de fond. On a travaillé fort et on a pris les bonnes décisions pour atteindre nos objectifs. C'est pourquoi, dans le contexte de la crise actuelle, le système financier est une partie de la solution et non la source du problème. And now, as Marci said, I'm working for the United Nations to channel the immense power of that financial system to help solve the climate crisis. This transformation to a sustainable system is gathering pace. Only last week, global financial institutions controlling over $30 trillion of assets committed to the transition to a net zero economy. But as we've left it very late, much more will be required. The private sector is critical to addressing climate change, but it won't solve it on its own. Your work on climate is vital for Canada, and it's an inspiration to the world. Everyone these days, well, almost everyone, recognizes the climate is changing. But when it comes to politics, you make your own weather. Canada was going nowhere fast on climate before this government took office. Now, we have a legislated commitment to net zero, and we're the first country in the G20 with a carbon price policy serious enough to make a difference. Ce soir, je veux remercier le Premier ministre Trudeau et son équipe pour le leadership dont ils ont fait preuve. Et merci à vous tous qui avez travaillé si fort pour changer la politique climatique canadienne pour le mieux. C'est important de célébrer les progrès qu'on a réalisés au cours des 5 dernières années, mais c'est encore plus important qu'on continue d'avancer. Le monde commence à s'attaquer à la crise climatique. Pour bâtir l'économie durable dont on a besoin et protéger l'avenir que nos petits-enfants méritent, on a encore énormément de travail à faire. Thinking about how to achieve that future, to go to where the puck is going, is why I spent much of last year writing that book that Terry was holding up. For those of you who've already bought it, and I assume you did, Terry, thank you. For those of you who've read it, thank you even more. If you haven't yet, I'd like to highlight one of its core points. We're living in a time that confuses market value with human values. A world where we know the price of Amazon, but not the value of the Amazon. A world where technology threatens to replace our jobs rather than improve them. Now, I've worked at the center of markets all of my professional life. And let me tell you something important about them. Markets are the most powerful instrument we've ever created. Their energy and dynamism can be harnessed and directed to serve great purposes. But the market is also indifferent to human suffering, and it can be blind to our greatest needs. That's why politicians who worship the market tend to deliver policies that hurt people. And those who default to laissez-faire leave us unprepared for the future. But simply, markets don't have values. People do. And it's our responsibility to close the gap between what we value and what the market prices. And that is the work of politics. That's the work you do when you convince your neighbors to support a candidate who will put a price on pollution because the market doesn't. Or when you created the Canada Child Benefit because the market left 1 million Canadian kids in poverty. I didn't choose those two examples by accident. They're two of the most important policies of our lifetimes. Why? Because they're grounded in human values, values of fairness, solidarity, and sustainability, and they produce real results for people. They'll help change the climate, and they'll help improve the futures of millions of Canadians. Ces exemples soulignent que les pays ne sont pas impuissants face aux tendances qui frappent notre monde. Les politiques qu'on met en œuvre chez nous comptent. Nous n'avons pas à être à la merci des caprices de l'économie mondiale, mais nous le deviendrons si nous n'apprécions pas leur impact et nous n'essayons pas de les utiliser à notre avantage. En cette période de changement et de crise sans précédent, on a besoin de plus de leadership. La COVID a exposé les écarts qui persistent dans notre société. La révolution numérique, bien qu'elle présente de nombreuses opportunités, menace aussi d'exacerber les inégalités si nous la laissons suivre son cours. La transition écologique, bien qu'essentielle et largement positive, va demander des énormes changements, des changements structurels en très peu de temps. If ignored, these forces could deepen our divisions, but if they're channeled, they can grow our economy for the benefit of all Canadians. So we need to focus technology on improving the quality of existing jobs, on enabling workers to build their skills, and helping them unleash their creativity through greater connectivity across Canada and with the wider world. In short, we must choose to be digital by design rather than digital by default. La transition écologique, ce n'est pas dans 25 ans. La transition écologique, c'est maintenant. Elle a commencé il y a moins de 10 ans et elle ne fait que s'accélérer d'année en année. L'ère de l'énergie propre est arrivée et ça représente la plus grande opportunité économique de notre époque. C'est une opportunité que le Canada doit saisir pour l'avenir de nos enfants et l'avenir de notre planète. On climate, we can move quickly to a zero-carbon electricity grid and electrify as much of our transportation and industrial processes as possible. We can accelerate our production and adoption of electric vehicles, transform the energy efficiency of our homes and offices, and channel the same type of determined focus of engineers, entrepreneurs, and governments that I saw in Alberta growing up to turn hydrogen and carbon capture from concepts into commercial realities. Most fundamentally, we must bring everyone along by creating the jobs of the present and the future, particularly in the regions of the country like my home province that will face the largest adjustment. This points to another type of sustainability. Budget choices are often described in terms of the sustainability of debts, but they're really about the sustainability of people's livelihoods. People know that spending only on the present won't deliver a better future for them and their children. And so once we exit COVID, we will need broad-based growth driven by investments in the digital and sustainable engines of our future and policies that support the full participation of all Canadians in our economy. In other words, a sustainable recovery isn't a slogan. It's what the next generation deserves, and it's what we need right now. When faced with huge challenges, it's tempting to deny they're real. It's seductive to delay what needs to get done. But if we delay and deny, change will be something that happens to us, and it will hit the most vulnerable Canadians the hardest. That's not how we built the best country in the world. We don't deny our problems. We defeat them. We build our tomorrow. Now, when someone starts talking about our successes, Canadians often begin to get uncomfortable. Because after all, humility is a core Canadian value. Humility means planning for things that can go wrong, like financial crises and pandemics. It means setting ambitious goals, knowing that we need to work together to achieve them. Humility means never being satisfied with all that we've achieved, but knowing that by staying true to our values, we can build an even better country for everyone. And to me, humility means recognizing the great good fortune that I've had growing up and the responsibility of service that comes with that. And that's why I'll do whatever I can to support the Liberal Party in our efforts to build a better future for Canadians. Merci de m'avoir invité ce soir et merci de tout ce que vous faites tous les jours pour faire avancer notre pays. So Marci, I look forward to our conversation.
Let's do that right now, shall we, Marc? Thank you so very much. You said that markets don't have values, but people do. How does a former Bank of Canada governor come to that conclusion?
Well, a central bank governor that lives through a series of crises. As you may recall, I became Bank Canada governor literally at the start of the global financial crisis. In the last half hour of my term as Bank of England governor was the COVID crisis had begun, and we put in place a series of emergency measures with others at that point. So I lived through a series of crises, and part of the question was, well, what is driving the crisis? Is there a common root? And my judgment has been that part of it was an imbalance between the value of the market and the values of society. And we can go into that in more detail if you wish. But more positively, what we have seen with COVID by the reactions of Canadians, supportive Canadians, as I mentioned at the outset, of each other, has been these fundamental values of solidarity, of compassion, of fairness, responsibility. And that gives hope, because that creates the ability to build a better society. When we know what we value at the core, we can put the market in the service of those values. And that's very much what we are starting to do. We have much more work to do on it, but we're starting to do with respect to climate change.
How did you arrive at those tenets? You talked about humility. You just mentioned solidarity and fairness. The others, there's 7 of them in your book, are responsibility, resilience, sustainability, dynamism. It must have been difficult to fit all that you were thinking based on all of your experience into 7 buckets.
Well, there's 2 things. First, humility was easy to arrive at. If you make a series of mistakes over your life, you discover that humility is an important value. And if you live through a series of crises, you realize that in many cases, a little more humility of authorities, masters of the universe in finance, others would have helped avoid the situation if you think about what could go wrong and responsibility to protect it. But the core answer to your question is, I sat down and set out the question for myself, which was your first question. In effect, is there some common root to these series of crises? What is it about them? What had I learned? And I arrived at those values sort of through reflection on those crises, and very importantly, our responses to them and what worked. So in the response to the financial crisis, much less an issue for Canada, to the credit of the Canadian financial system and Canadians by extension. But internationally, the importance of responsibility and reinstilling responsibility and a sense of solidarity. In other words, in that case, a sense of responsibility for the system as well as yourself, not just for your own institution, a sense of solidarity, if you're running a bank, with the ultimate clients you have, peoples, said another way, and communities. And what are you giving back, and how does your purpose actually serve to bring them along as well? And so the answer is, it's revealed through human experience. And the most difficult, you learn a lot about people. We've learned a lot about ourselves during this period of this difficult period of COVID, and much of what we see is to credit, and that which we don't like, we need to address.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, because here we're living through a pandemic. Climate change, obviously, is on the radar in a big, big way. Systemic racism, economic disparity, all of these things. Do we need a complete reset?
I think not. I wouldn't use that term, not least because we need to build on the core values that we have and reinforce them. So, for example, we just talked about the solidarity shown through the crisis, the sense of compassion. In parallel, though, we have seen in Canada the inequalities that still exist in our society, and in fact, those inequalities have been deepened. Certain groups are more likely to lose their jobs. They're much more likely to be infected with this terrible disease, and much more likely to have worse health outcomes when they are infected with the disease. This goes to the heart of how do we bring everyone to the same level? How do we take full responsibility for each other? So I don't view that as a reset, but as a reaffirmation of our core Canadian values and living up to them. And it's one of the things that I love about this country, which is not being satisfied, always having a sense of we need to make greater progress, and progress in the broad sense of it, progress across the society, not measured by a GDP number or a dollar figure, but progress. And we look in the mirror and we recognize there's more. Much has been done, but much more needs to be done. And I think that's we can take both the good and the challenge of COVID as we move forward.
Not a reset, but a reaffirmation. Want to talk more about COVID and what I like to call the COVID pause, because this pandemic has taught us so much, Marc, many lessons. You mentioned some of them. Who has fallen through the cracks? How can we help? How can we build back better? What can we do? You know, who's hurting? Family, values, all of those things. Give us some insight into your world and how you've been living and how you've been dealing with this and the lessons that you've learned.
Yeah, I'm very much one of the fortunate ones in this pandemic, in that how I've been living is largely in this room. I've taken to sleeping at the office effectively because this is where I do my work and my writing and my conversations like this, which is a privilege. I'm not on the front lines. I'm not out there exposed. And I recognize that. I recognize with that comes a responsibility to do what I can to support those who are. That's the first. I also recognize I'm very fortunate in that all of our family is not together, but our youngest children are here. You know, we have the family, the regular family meals and the tightness that and the better understanding that comes with that. And you wonder why, I wonder why I didn't have that all the way through, and regret that I didn't have it, but cherish it now that I have. But I, like others, have a parent who I haven't seen and cannot see. I have friends who have died, as a consequence of this. So we're all touched by it. And I'm also conscious as well that it's exceptionally difficult for groups of people that live a few blocks away from me. In fact, a group of people who live across the street from me. Il y a des sœurs grises, la maison de la retraite des sœurs grises, des volontiers qui ont travaillé depuis longtemps à travers Québec et à travers l'Ontario. Ils sont là, il y a environ 200-250, et il y avait quelques éclosions de COVID là. Mais heureusement, maintenant, elles sont tous vaccinées, et aujourd'hui elles se promènent au soleil. So there's these difficult things. There's a very positive that's reinforced in the family, your own values, what matters. There's a consciousness of the difficulties sometimes touching you personally, but more broadly in society. And I think the last thing is, there is also a weight, a sort of inchoate weight on all of us from the situation, which is why we need to band together and support each other as much as possible.
Yeah, and that leads to resilience, and that's one of the tenets. How does resilience figure into everything?
Well, we've drawn on our resilience. Fortunately, we're resilient people, and we've shown it. But I think of it as well, and part of my professional career has been that it has been to build resilience, to plan for failure, literally plan. Normally don't, it doesn't sound very, national humility strategy, plan for failure. These are difficult things, but necessary, absolutely necessary. So you think about what can go wrong, and you build it up. You build buffers. And part of the conversation, just before we started our conversation, I heard Patty Hajdu telling the story of one of her constituents who needed a payday loan, $40 payday loan because of the money. There's an example of what happens when individuals don't have buffers, and the importance of things like the Canada Child Benefit, which I referenced, that provide some of those buffers, or the possibility of that buffer, so that people have the resilience. And I think we really are all reflecting on whether those buffers are strong enough for individuals first and foremost. But then also we have to look, from a policy perspective, do we have the right buffers and resilience in the financial system, in the health system, even in things that haven't hit us yet, but might in technology and cyber and other areas. This is the duty of government.
Mm-hmm. And it's one thing to say, Marc, that we need to change, and we do. on so many levels. There are a lot of people watching right now and saying, okay, that's fine. Systems need to change. Governments need to pivot. How do I do this on an individual basis, from a base level?
Well, I think one of my experiences, I think, and those watching who've dedicated themselves to politics, to the party, and in other ways, know this, which is that being active in your community, helping others, volunteering, it's contagious. It's contagious in a good way. It's like a muscle that grows with exercise, as opposed to a finite resource that is taken away. And that's, the small things, the small acts of kindness and charity and volunteering and helping, that's what makes up our society. That's what makes it great. And so all of us have that responsibility. And in the end, you think about what we leave as individuals, and it's those legacies of values. That's my view. In the end, it's how we've lived our lives and the impressions we've left on others, and the legacies of those values, and the service that those who come after us will bring to continue to build a better country and a better community for all.
Oh my gosh, I just got chills when you talked about legacy, because I know that that's how you ended your book. You were thinking about legacy. You were thinking about all of the things that you just said. And I wrote a book recently, and I began my book that way because I was trying to, I did, and I was trying to figure out, how I would use my microphone next, what I would do. Was I doing enough? I was thinking about my dad and this story that he used to tell. It was based on a poem called The Dash. And he would ask his kids, holding this cutout of a tombstone, every year at the beginning of each year, he would say, what's the most important thing on this tombstone? The kids would never get it right. And he would say the most important thing was the smallest thing. It was the dash. Yeah. It's how you live your life. It's all the things that you just said. So was really thinking about that. So when you said that, I get it. I get the sense, Marc, that this wasn't the book that you wanted to write, or what you wanted to write, I'm sure, but you had to write. If you wanted to write it, you had to write it because you had so much bottled up. You had seen so much, your experience, it's all in there. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, let's just stop and let the beginning of your book and that story and let that land for a moment, because that's right. It's the dash, but it's also, I think, and your father would say, and I know you think this way, it's what the dash means to others and what it means for others. And to your question on writing the book, I really did. I wanted to write the book because I had, I've been fortunate. I've had these experiences. I felt I had elements of what I thought I wanted to say, but I certainly didn't know how it was going to end. And I didn't know, for example, that I would gravitate towards these 7 values as being important for true economic prosperity. And just to be clear, they're values for true economic prosperity, not for the fullness of human existence. I don't pretend to have that. But it was the process of writing it, reflecting. I found very helpful and sharpened my sense of what needs to be done and the direction in which we need to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And tell us a little bit about who might have helped or informed what you wrote. Because often the biggest lessons in life are the ones we learn, people that we meet, people that we encounter, a book that we might read. Yeah.
Well, okay, this will sound slightly odd. I mean, a lot of people informed it, but the book opens with a challenge, and it was a challenge from the Pope, actually, and which was to a group of people who were meeting to discuss the future of basically discussing a fairer economy. And it was socialist labor leaders from Argentina and Mohammed Yunus, who'd founded microcredit, and a wide range of people from all faiths and none, and academics, Jeff Sachs, other people like that. And I had the honor of being invited. And the Pope told a parable, which was, he begins, Terry knows this because he got to page 260 at least, but he tells a parable before he threw it down in disgust, where he says, we're having lunch, and which is true, and it is Italy or Vatican, and says, we're going to start lunch with wine, and wine is many things. It has a bouquet, it has a taste, a color, and it has alcohol, so it enriches all of our senses. At the end of lunch, we'll have grappa. It's one thing. It's alcohol. It's wine distilled. And then he says, people, humanity is many things. We're passionate, we're rational, we're altruistic, we're caring, we're self-interested. The market is one thing. It's self-interest. And your job, points to everyone in the room, is to turn the grappa back into wine, turn the market back into humanity. And finishes and says, this isn't theology, this is reality, this is the truth. And that's a charge. Now, that was a charge that was about 7 years ago that he gave it, and I took it away and didn't get around to really reflecting on it properly and trying to give an answer. But to give away the ending of the book, it concludes, and that's how you turn grappa back into wine, which I'm not sure I've totally cracked it, but it's along what you said, which is a sense of legacy in its most positive sense. And to be clear, it's legacy not that somebody remembers you, but your actions leave, they breed better and better actions by others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember Maya Angelou said something to that effect, that people may not remember, all the things that you did, but they will remember how you made them feel. Right, which speaks to all of that. I find as well, Marc, that I quite admire the pivoting that you've done. I did a big one myself, from journalism to politics, but you've done so many different things, and that takes courage. And sometimes it means moving from a place of comfort to discomfort. But that's where we find the biggest lessons, right?
I totally agree. It's and it's both exhilarating and discomforting. I mean, it's challenging. But I think you find that I'm sure you find your previous experience. Well, I can tell your previous experiences make you better at what you're doing today, and make you more rounded. You have that perspective. And that's the opportunity. I was fortunate both to have been in the private sector on the market side, if you will, and that I think I would have been much worse. Maybe I'll put it in the negative. I would have been a much worse governor of the Bank of Canada in England if I hadn't had that private sector experience, because I knew both the strengths and the very real weaknesses in that area. And as I've moved into working on climate, I think that knowledge, both on the public and private side, I hope, is going to help with others harness the power of the market to help solve climate change. Now, as I said, very importantly, that's a very important part of the puzzle. But what the members of this convention have been doing and the government has been doing has been absolutely essential, because it sets the bar and it shows a direction for where we are going on climate. We're going to address it. And that turns the risk into an enormous opportunity and really harnesses the power of the market. Now, we need to keep going and we need to do more, but we are on the right track. Yeah,
because as you've said, we left it. We left it late, but there's still time to pivot, right? And we're doing that now. And not just for us, but for our kids and for our grandkids.
Yeah, there was time to pivot. There's not time to pivot again, I think is the way I would put it. We've made the pivot, but we've got to keep going. We've got to reinforce. It's another point of reinforcement that as we talked earlier.
So tell me about life now and what life looks like in Marc Carney's world.
Well, it looks, it's like many of us. I'm very busy. I I spend about half my time for the UN, which involves cajoling financial institutions around the world to get on the net zero bus, if you will, and get on clearly and be part of the solution. That is there is real momentum there, but I think, and you know this, and colleagues know this. When you have these windows of opportunity, you have to jump through them and you have to take advantage of them. And it'd be very easy to declare victory with a half measure, and that's the tragedy in a situation like this. So a huge amount of work for the UN and for COP26, and then I also work in the private sector to try to put my words into action, so that and a major Canadian company called Brookfield, which it builds the backbone of the global economy. It's one of the biggest investors in the world, and it's the biggest private renewable power company effectively in the world. And what it's looking to do is to go to all these companies around the world and put them on the path to net zero, invest alongside that. So again, this area between the social objectives, what we want, and trying to put that into action, both through global system, but also local action. So that's what life looks like. And then the other thing, I'll be honest, I try and get out and exercise. The more that's about all I can do. And full disclosure, I had yesterday I was having a lovely run. And I saw, beaver. I saw, so the ducks were coming back, etc. And then I pulled my calf muscle and I limped home, and I felt every one of my 56 years. But it's you got to take the. It was a net good. It was a net good run.
This was a good run. Right here. Thank you so much, Marc. I know that everybody that's a part of our virtual Liberal convention, our national convention, is just thrilled right now just to hear your stories. Thank you for sharing them. Thank you for sharing your life lessons. Thank you for telling us, frankly, what we need to hear. Appreciate you and appreciate the time.
Thank you, Marci. A great pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
Well, thank you, Marc. And thank you, Marci. That was an engaging and timely discussion and provided really a great primer to some of the extremely important topics addressed in Marc's book, and being faced not just by Canadians, but by people on this pale blue dot we call home. Our next keynote comes from a woman we all admire. She is known for her tenacity, dedication to a variety of causes, and boundless energy for the work that she takes on. I had the great fortune to host her at Simon Fraser University during the last election, and she actually voted for my riding at the exact moment that my daughter took her first steps, just outside that very same voting booth. So it was a very special day that I will never forget. She is a mother, she is a feminist, a yogi, and a tireless supporter of the work of our party and, of course, of our leader. I am, of course, referring to Sophie Grégoire Trudeau. Sophie, on behalf of the thousands of Liberals joining from across the country, welcome, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Hello, dear friends, courageous friends and allies. Bonjour, mes amis. On se retrouve enfin, finally, after such a challenging year. We are reunited. This is a first virtual Liberal convention with all of you Canadians tuning in from across the country. Et on se retrouve aujourd'hui peut-être pas aussi proches physiquement les uns des autres comme on l'a fait à travers les années, mais c'est à travers les moments difficiles qu'on se rend vraiment compte à quel point le Parti libéral du Canada est fort. On est unis et on est prêt à affronter le présent et à bâtir l'avenir. And looking back and thinking about previous Liberal conventions, I can still feel the uniting energy, the smiles, the accumulated work and long hours, the friendly handshakes, the tears of joy, and how much more we've always wanted to do for all families, for all our grandkids, and for this planet and generations to come. Now, on another note, my dad always told me two things when I was young, amongst others. But first, stop rushing, because you're just slowing yourself down. And that in life, there are those who watch things happen, those who make things happen, and those who wonder what happened. Well, let's just put it this way. To all our volunteers, to our co-chairs, to Rachel, Marci, Terry, and Mona, and all MPs and other team members across the country, thank you for making this conference happen. I have to admit that speaking to you today, standing here healthy, that my heart pinches a little because we Canadians and the world have been through so much this past year. I have seen firsthand all the sacrifices many of you have made to help us navigate this challenging period. Unfortunately, contracting COVID didn't develop into any serious health issues for me, but that was not and still isn't the case for so many. These past months have been a learning experience on so many levels, and as a mental health and gender equality advocate, I've spoken virtually and obviously from a distance to isolated mothers in despair, to struggling families trying to cope with disease and mental illness, to victims of domestic abuse, to therapists, psychiatrists, and medical experts trying to help them all, but who are also feeling depleted. We need to face many troubling realities, and wishing things were different is just not going to cut it. Well, the Liberal team across the country, all of you, you rolled up your sleeves, you put on your masks, and you raised the bar by doing so much to help our most vulnerable citizens. And sometimes those citizens are direct family members or friends, and most of all, they are always our fellow Canadians and neighbors. We are all in this together, and we are going to pull through together. En regardant l'année qui vient de passer, comme on dit en bon français, il n'y en aura pas de facile. Mais en cette période difficile que l'équipe libérale, que chacun d'entre vous a fait, vraiment a fait tout son possible pour aider les Canadiens qui souffrent le plus et aussi pour redresser notre économie de manière vraiment responsable et de manière fructueuse. Et soyons clairs, l'équipe libérale est là pour les Canadiens et on va tout faire pour protéger leur santé et les soutenir tout au long de cette crise mondiale de laquelle on a tellement de leçons à apprendre. On travaille déjà depuis des années à bâtir une économie plus juste et plus verte et une société plus égalitaire pour tous. Et on est loin de s'arrêter. On comprend l'urgence de la situation et on ne vous laissera pas tomber, mes amis. Moi, j'ai grandi dans une famille avec des membres du milieu médical et j'ai toujours été sensibilisée à leur travail dévoué. Mais vraiment, je dois avouer qu'à travers la pandémie, je n'ai jamais été aussi reconnaissante envers le travail des travailleurs de première ligne qui n'ont ménagé vraiment aucun effort pour venir en aide aux autres, pour venir en aide aux Canadiens. Merci du fond du cœur to all the frontline workers and all the sacrifices that you have made to help Canadians. Thank you so much. We care. The Liberal Party cares about the lives of Canadians and their struggles, and we really want everyone to have a fairer chance at success. And to succeed in this endeavor, gender equality is a priority. My feminist husband, Justin, and the Liberal team are tackling the She session head on, as this pandemic has had devastating effects on the lives of so many Canadian women and their families. And, you know, working with women and men as true allies is the only way forward to create more justice. And just so we are all aware, with the successful Liberal by-elections last year in Toronto and York Centre, Marci Ien and Yara Sachs helped us for the first time in our history to officially have 100 women representing Canadians in the House of Commons. And wait until you get to know more about our task force on women and the economy. Now, Canada's future and competitiveness depends on the ability of women to participate equally and fully in our workforce. And this, my friends, is just a start. Vous savez, en tant que militante pour l'égalité des sexes, je suis fière que mon mari, féministe, Justin, et toute son équipe comprennent à quel point c'est important de reconnaître que l'on fait face à une récession au féminin. Les mesures que le gouvernement fédéral prend pour s'assurer que toutes les femmes canadiennes et que nos filles puissent réaliser leur plein potentiel sont réelles. Les femmes et les filles façonnent notre monde à tous les jours pour le mieux. Et les femmes autochtones, les femmes transgenres, les femmes de toutes les origines et orientations sexuelles, les femmes en situation de handicap et de toutes les communautés, vous comptez et on est là pour vous aider. L'équipe libérale s'engage à soutenir les femmes aussi entrepreneurs, mais aussi toutes les mamans qui ont peine à rejoindre les deux bouts. Les services de garde abordables, c'est essentiel. L'allocation canadienne pour enfants l'est aussi. Et vous savez, j'ai rencontré des mères qui m'ont confié que ça change tout pour elles. Eh bien, ça va continuer et le Parti libéral va en faire encore plus au cours des prochaines années pour s'assurer de créer encore plus d'opportunités pour les femmes sur le marché du travail et dans toutes les sphères de la société. The Liberal Party is committed. We are ready. and we will rise to the challenges and opportunities ahead. We will keep moving forward with the strong actions that Canadians from across the country are counting on. And you know what? There has never been a more important time to get involved, to get creative, to get united, to get courageous, and to have a sustainable and promising vision for this country. Canada needs to continue to lead on so many fronts so we can inspire others to do the same. With gender equality policies, a plan for a prosperous, roaring green economy and creating more good-paying jobs for all Canadians, and of course, ensuring that everyone has access to safe and effective vaccines. Our health and our economy will start roaring, dear friends. We can do this. Oh, and you know, there's another great thing we've accomplished together. We've moved forward with our first ever virtual open town halls and virtual grassroots fundraisers. And more than 10,000 volunteers have stepped up, and more than 6,000 Canadians have taken part in our online open policy process. And we've hit a new all-time record for grassroots monthly donors. And I'm really excited to see and meet always talented, accomplished, and devoted new Liberal candidates. We really are one big family, and we are looking towards a better future with so much vision, so much renewed energy, compassion, and really deep expertise. We got this. We got each other's backs, minds, and hearts. On travaille pour vous. On a besoin de vous pour faire avancer notre mouvement, pour plus de justice dans notre société. Le Parti libéral du Canada va continuer à prendre des mesures audacieuses pour que chacun d'entre nous puisse compter sur nous quand ça vient à votre santé, vos emplois, un environnement sain et protégé et une économie florissante. On a déjà les manches retroussées et la main à la pâte, et on ne vous lâchera pas. You know, it is said that to start a race, it takes courage. But that to finish a race, it takes faith. Faith in yourself, faith in each other, and of course, my fellow Liberals, faith in Canadians. It's time. It's time to face our challenges and lead by example. Let us never forget what we have been through together, and let's draw on that to build back better. What do we all have in common? You know. Hope and hard work means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But to me, it's simple. It all comes down to love for Canada and loving every single Canadian. Je vous aime, mes amis. J'ai confiance en nous. Bon congrès. All my best to your loved ones. Let's keep Canada moving forward.
Sophie, thank you so very much. Merci beaucoup for your inspiring words this evening and for all that you do to support the work that we do to make this country a better place for our families and for our kids and the generations to come. We are now at our final conversation of the evening between the co-host of a podcast entitled Pod Save the World, love that title, and someone who's actually been out of this world and up to space. Ben Rhodes is an American writer. He is a political commentator and former Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications and Speechwriting under President Barack Obama. He is the co-chair of the National Security Action and a political NGO. He can be seen regularly on NBC News and MSNBC as a political commentator, and we are thrilled to have him here with us this evening in conversation with someone who understands the global context very, very well, Marc Garneau. Marc, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Marci, and good evening, dear friends. Bonsoir, mes chers amis. I was going to give an introduction to Ben, but Marci did such a beautiful job. So I'll just say a few things in French before we get into our conversation. Comme vous l'avez entendu, Ben Rhodes est un écrivain et un commentateur politique américain. Il fut le conseiller national adjoint pour les communications stratégiques et les discours pendant 8 ans sous la présidence de Barack Obama. La discussion ce soir va se faire en anglais, mais je voulais, juste avant de commencer, vous donner une petite anecdote. J'ai eu la chance de parler avec mon homologue américain, le secrétaire d'État Antony Blinken, l'autre jour, et je me suis aperçu qu'il parle un français impeccable. Alors, on fait nos conversations dans les 2 langues officielles et je voulais que vous le sachiez. Alors, sans plus tarder, on va commencer la discussion ce soir parce qu'on a envie d'écouter notre cher invité, Ben Rhodes. So, Ben, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We have a bunch of questions about essentially knowing a little bit more about how you believe that our relationship, and particularly the direction that the United States is going to be taking under the new administration, what is that direction? So I'm going to start with a question as follows, and it's a big question. Ben, you were one of the very few people in the room when Barack Obama made foreign policy decisions through his presidency during the 8 years that you were with him. Today, I think it's probably very safe to say that the world has changed quite a bit since you were in the White House, and we've seen a wave of populism. We've seen a growth in authoritarianism, and more, of course, uncertainty because of the pandemic that's with all of us. Meanwhile, countries like Canada, progressive countries like Canada, we've remained at the table. And we're very, very glad that you're back with us as we begin to do things together. So let me start with that big question. From your unique vantage point and based on your experience, how do you see the state of the world today?
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Minister, and all the friends of mine in the Liberal Party. It's such an honor and a treat, really, to be with you. I think you framed it well in the sense that in those 8 years, watching President Obama up close, but also Vice President Biden was in the room, Tony Blinken was in the room, Jake Sullivan, a lot of the same characters were in those rooms. A lot of the foreign policy issues, were familiar and traditional. How do you deal with the threat of terrorism? How do you deal with challenges from Russia? How do you deal with nuclear proliferation? But there was also this building trend of populism and authoritarianism that obviously came to fruition in our country under Donald Trump, but also I think has shaped politics in much of the world. And when I look at the world today, yes, we know the challenges. We know we have COVID to deal with. We know that we have climate change to deal with. We know that there's ongoing threats to our countries. But to me, when I look out at the international landscape, the big question that is going to shape the next generation of foreign policy and domestic politics is the success of democracy in the world. Can democracy overcome the latest challenge of an authoritarian trend that could come from populist parties within our own countries that tend to veer to the far right, or from competitors like China abroad that have an alternative model of governance? And in my judgment, democracies, small d democracies, are the best positioned to solve problems for people. They're best positioned to solve the climate crisis, but they have to acknowledge that the climate crisis exists. They're best positioned to make sure that the economic recovery from COVID delivers for citizens and doesn't contribute to the inequality that is continuing to create tension around the world. And they're best positioned to not go down the road of a form of nationalism that can lead to conflict, be it trade wars or real conflicts. So to me, as I look out at the world, I think that the challenge and the opportunity is both what is the future of democracy inside of our own countries and around the world. And one of the reasons why I'm so glad to participate is I think that as an American, the success of parties like the Liberal Party in Canada has something to do with my future and has something to do with the future of people, not just in Canada, but around the world, because this is the issue of our time. What is the future of liberal democracy in our countries and around the world?
Well, thank you very much. I think that people who live in our two countries may sometimes take democracy for granted. But as we are seeing in the world today, that is certainly not the case. Canada and the United States, I think, are eager to do some big things, I would say, together. Certainly when President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau met and they drew a roadmap, there are some fairly ambitious things that we have the potential of doing together. But also we want to do it with other countries as well. And that talks to a multilateral approach in how we engage with the rest of the world. And I think that it's probably true to say that some of our multilateral organizations have suffered a little bit, have taken a bit of a beating in the last few years, and yet they are essential for us to engage the rest of the world in a meaningful and a constructive way. So how will the United States re-engage with the world in a meaningful and constructive way?
Well, I think that, look, multilateralism, it's become a truism that the problems that we face depend upon international cooperation. Unfortunately, the United States, when you look at the history of the last few decades, where we've put our foot wrong is often when we've worked outside of the multilateral system, whether that was invading Iraq or whether that was a Trump administration deciding to literally confront a global pandemic by stepping out of the World Health Organization. The reality is that multilateralism, multilateral institutions are what we make of them. And when I think about the World Health Organization, for instance, yes, it's a flawed organization. At the beginning of the Ebola crisis, for instance, in 2014, it was slow to kick into action. It was slow to call out the threat. But what did the United States do with friends like Canada is say, well, we need to make this work better. We need to make the WHO work. And I think if you look at the experience of COVID, everybody kind of had to deal with it on their own because there was not a coordinated multilateral response, in large part because the United States vacated that role. Canada was trying to align responses. Canada was trying to work with other countries, of course. But it takes the United States being a part of that as well. It takes as many countries as possible to make the multilateral system work. And so when you look at the issues that impact people's lives, can we deal with the climate crisis? Well, we have to deal with the framework of the Paris Agreement, which is under the auspices of a UN negotiated process. 200 countries have to come together and figure out how to raise our ambition to deal with the climate crisis. If we want to defeat the next pandemic and stop it before it reaches our borders, we need to invest in the World Health Organization, in early warning systems, in research and development to stamp out pandemics around the world. Traditional security threats, like the threat of terrorism, of course, depend upon the capacity to see threats in other countries and to deal with them before it leads to a tragic attack. So to me, the multilateral system clearly is in need of some update and some renovation, but it's also never been more relevant and essential. And I think the Biden team understands this intuitively. I think Justin Trudeau has made this such a centerpiece of his tenure as prime minister. And one of the things that I watched in recent years is him become an increasing leader in the G7, in the G20, in the multilateral system. And I think with an American partner, there's so much more that you can achieve in making multilateralism work for people and making multilateralism relevant, not just to the challenges that the system was designed for, which was largely the Cold War, or in some cases, the post-9/11 world. We're in a new world. We're in a post-COVID world. We're in a world in which democracy is under threat. And I think if the United States, Canada, and like-minded countries are forming the kind of core of that multilateral system, and then seeking cooperation with China on climate change or Russia on nuclear nonproliferation, then you can have positive outcomes. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be a lot better than if we all go it alone.
Well, thank you very much. And I think you've given some very good examples of how the United States under the new administration has begun to re-engage, working, for example, as you say, with the World Health Organization, recommitting to the Paris Accord targets and that process to deal with the very, very challenging issue of climate change. So let me dig a little bit more on authoritarianism. At a time when people are tending to look inward more, authoritarian regimes are in some cases acting like bullies on the world stage and using coercive diplomacy when the values of, as you point out, of democracy and human rights are under attack. In some parts of the world, certainly, and we have lots of examples of it. So what does leadership look like in dealing with regimes that are tending to err towards the authoritarian approach in dealing with the rest of the world? How can like-minded democracies work together in the face of these challenges?
Well, I guess I'd highlight three things. First of all, it is absolutely essential to realize that the most powerful rebuke of authoritarianism is what we do inside of our own countries. You know, the United States obviously has a ton of work to do to restore our democratic example, to make sure that, you know, people can vote, to make sure that we're upholding democratic norms in our country. But I think whether it's Canada, the US, or any other democracy, these issues have often been framed around foreign policy and democracy promotion. It's the example that we set when you talk to activists and dissidents and people struggling for democracy in places where they don't have it, the number one thing that they point to is, what example are you setting? Can you show that democracy is working? Can you show that democracy delivers? Can you show what it means to have an inclusive and equitable society? That model, that example is ultimately more powerful than any individual foreign policy that you could pursue. And again, I think that's why it's so important that you have a successful Liberal Party in Canada that is showing we can update and regenerate and rejuvenate our democracy over time and be a part of the example that is set for why democracy is the best form of government. And it's going to take different flavors and different cultures in different countries. But again, it starts with that example. I think the second thing is we do have to give voice to our democratic values. And I'm reminded, at the end of the Obama years, on his final foreign trip, which was at an APEC summit in Lima, Peru, his final bilateral meeting was with Justin Trudeau. And that was by design. This is our closest friend, both geographically, but I think also dispositionally on the world stage. President Obama and Prime Minister Trudeau had struck up a close friendship. And President Obama said to him, he said, look, given the guy who's coming in after me, you're probably going to have to speak out a little bit more on behalf of values around the world, on behalf of principles around the world, to do something, obviously not to take the place of the United States and obviously not to take your eye off the ball of what Canadians are interested in, but giving voice to those values. And it was a bit of a handing off of the torch, if you will, for that aspect of moral leadership. And I think Justin Trudeau has made good on that discussion. You need to speak out in multilateral fora. You need to give voice to things. If there are injustices around the world, you need to speak about them. If there is a refugee crisis around the world, you have to demonstrate that you're going to do your part to settle that consistent with your values. And so I do think we should not overlook the fact that our words matter. And they're heard. They're heard by people struggling for democracy. They're heard by people who are trying to stamp out democracy. And then the third thing I think is that countries need to come together to try to uphold certain norms and basic values and principles around the world. When democracies are speaking together, the kind of bullying that you speak about is much harder. Because what a country that take a China, for example, it's very hard for individual countries to take a stand against something that China has done. But if you have a group of democracies speaking together on behalf of a set of values, not against China, but on behalf of a set of principles, then I think the world is much stronger. So when you look at, I think, the very effective diplomacy and multilateralism that was brought to bear in speaking out against arbitrary detention, including, of course, the detention of the two Michaels and the plight that their families are going through that is so damaging and so painful for all of us to watch, that's the kind of approach that makes it harder for countries to divide democracies or to bully individual countries. When we all speak together, I think over time you get better outcomes. So if you take those three things, tending to our democratic examples, speaking out for our values, and then speaking out collectively and acting collectively on behalf of a set of principles and norms around the world, I think over time you're going to get better results across the board.
Well, thank you very much. I'm particularly sort of drawn towards the first comment that you made, which is that you have to take care of things in your own backyard as well. And that is so true. If we are going to espouse multilaterally the values that we hold near and dear, whether it's democracy, human rights, we have to make sure as well that those same principles are upheld within our own countries, and otherwise fingers will be pointed. So that's a very important point, and I agree with what you've said about us acting together, because I think it does carry that stronger voice, that stronger legitimacy. So I agree with you entirely. My next question, well, let me start with a little bit of an anecdote. Back in 1984, I had the privilege of going to the White House. I was an astronaut at the time, and it was 2 weeks before my first flight. And I went to the Oval Office and met President Reagan at the time, and Prime Minister Mulroney was there. And it was a very, very, very special moment for me to have that opportunity to be there. And I've since been back to the White House, but I think a lot of Canadians are asking the question now, now that President Biden is in the White House. And so when our Prime Minister visits the White House at some point after this pandemic, how afraid should he be of President Biden's dog?
Not at all. Here's how I'd answer that. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old daughter, and at the end of the Obama administration, after the election, Vice President Biden hosted a party at his home for some of us, and gave my daughter Ella a stuffed animal of his dog. That to this day, she has no idea it's Joe Biden's dog, but she sleeps with that stuffed animal. So if that's the judgment of a 6-year-old girl, dogs are like people. You have to see the best in them, and usually there's a lot of good in dogs. And I think you'll get a warm welcome. Dogs tend to have pretty good instincts about people, so I think that they'll take well to Prime Minister Trudeau.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. That's very reassuring as I hear my own dog barking in the background right now. My next question is really about the politics between our two countries. Now, our two economies are very intricately linked. We have incredibly strong integrated supply chains. We are the two countries who do the most trade on this planet between each other. It is literally a staggering amount of either trade in products or in services between the two countries, and perhaps not surprising because we are neighbors and we each have products and services that we want. Having said that, the old expression is that all politics is local. So I'm going to ask you, how do you think Canada and the United States can work together to each achieve their political and economic objectives together? I know I'm being very general in casting that question, but it is very much a part of our relation between the two countries.
Well, I think, first of all, look, it's never been more true, right, that domestic policy and foreign policy are kind of blended together because, as we've already talked about, the United States, right, needs to fix our democracy in order to defend those values abroad. But also, you can't deal with climate change unless you're dealing with your own domestic energy economy. You can't deal with the type of inequality that threatens, I think, the cohesion of our democracies without taking actions at home. You have to make sure that we are leading the U.S. and Canada on research and development, the development of new technologies, not because we need to beat China per se, but because we want to be at the cutting edge of job-creating industries, right? And so it's natural, I think, you see in the United States right now, with the new administration, an effort to kind of rejuvenate American infrastructure, American innovation. That said, I mean, we've also learned in recent years to not take anything for granted. We Americans have just been through 4 very scary years that remind you that there's nothing in this world that you can take as a given. And you said this yourself, Mark, earlier. The border between the United States and Canada is one of the most successful things between nations in the history of the world. There's no conflict. There's largely open trade. It is a huge strategic asset to both of our countries that we have a border with that much commerce going back and forth that efficiently. It is a huge strategic asset, I think, and it was a good thing that even despite the anti-trade rhetoric, USMCA was able to get done to keep the idea of North America as a community that is beneficial to our competitiveness in the world. So I think the bottom line here is that in the US and in Canada, decisions will be made about how to revitalize the economy, how to invest in different sectors, how to secure supply chains against certain threats, how to make sure that we're updating infrastructure and innovation in both our countries to be competitive in this global economy and in a global economy where you have rising powers like China and India and others. As we do that, I would urge Americans and Canadians together to see that we are each other's partner in that effort and that we are much stronger with the capacity to resolve the inevitable trade irritants that come up and to see ultimately the interconnection between the United States and Canada as a huge strategic advantage, both in terms of our economies and our foreign policies and the things that we care about in the world. So it's very important that we are taking these steps in the U.S. Enormous investments are about to be made across the board in our economy. As we do, though, I think we can see what does infrastructure look like across North America? What do secure supply chains look like across North America? And how do we make sure that we continue to protect the asset that border is, even as we're making the necessary investments in our own national competitiveness?
Thank you. And if we zoom out a little bit, I mean, we have a very good, I believe, free trade treaty between the three countries of North America, Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And we negotiated this long and hard. And I think everybody felt that we came out with something that was modern and a replacement to the previous NAFTA. And we have built in, because of the countries involved, certain progressive requirements with respect to labor standards, with respect to environmental standards. And of course, we trade with the rest of the world as well. Is there a role for countries like ours to try to bring those other progressive elements into trade with the rest of the world? That is something certainly that doesn't exist everywhere in the world. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that kind of approach.
Look, I think absolutely. And obviously in the Obama administration, we were trying to do that with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think ended up being helpful to USMCA, because we had already talked about how do you update the NAFTA framework to bring in issues like labor and the environment. And I think it's right that there's been this insistence from workers and voters in our country and all democracies, frankly, that the model of the trade agreement be updated to bring in concerns for, well, let's make sure that there are provisions that are protecting workers, just as there are provisions that are sometimes protecting corporations. And I think with the environment, particularly given climate change and the need for everybody to do their part on climate change, it is important to be bringing in environmental standards into trade agreements, because there are different issues than there were 40 years ago. And when you look globally, when you look at like what is necessary to make the changes to the global economy that can allow us to deal with climate change, there's just no question that trade agreements are increasingly going to have to be scrutinized to deal with those two big issues. How are you bringing environmental standards in, and how are you using trade to narrow inequality? Because I think inequality can incubate conflict in different places. When you look at investments that are being made around the world that don't take into account environmental concerns, that's the next front for what's going to set us back on climate change. We could do everything that we need to do within our own borders in the US and Canada to begin to transition our economies at the speed that they need to transition. But if you have other countries lagging behind, and if you have investments in infrastructure and trade relationships in other parts of the world that are not taking clean energy and climate concerns into account, then it doesn't matter what we do. We're going to be pulled back anyway. So there's going to have to be a blending together, I think, of climate policy and trade policy and economic policy to take all of this into account. And one of the things that was interesting, I participated in some even discussions with Chinese officials on climate change, for instance. It used to be about what is China doing at home and what is the US doing. Increasingly, interestingly, it's about, well, where are our investments going and where are our trade agreements going? And how can we make sure that we're folding in the spirit and the letter of the Paris Agreement into what we're doing in other places? And I think Canada, as a G7 member, as a large economy, and as a country that is taking climate change seriously under this leadership, has a key voice to play in helping modernize global trade.
Well, thank you. And you spoke about climate change, and that's certainly something that President Biden and the Prime Minister spoke about at length, and a very, very strong commitment from both sides. But it also probably won't come as a complete surprise to you that not everybody, even today, believes in climate change, and that's been a hot topic of discussion at recently at a political convention that took place a couple of weeks ago. Given that the fact that there are still skeptics, and that we have to, if we're going to slay this dragon, and it's going to take time, that we have to work together. with countries in some cases with whom we have differences of opinion on other matters, but who are just as important as we are in terms of dealing with the challenge of climate change. How can we effectively do it? Is it through the Paris Accord and forums of that nature, or do we need to do even more than that? Because, I mean, I think everybody is now realizing that there is no more time to be wasted on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the science is clear on this. The first thing I'd say is that Paris was always intended to be the floor from which we build. And so the idea was get everybody into an agreement, get everybody doing their share, set up mechanisms by which we can begin to transition our economies, not just in the developed world, but in the developing world as well. And then update the ambition of Paris, increase the ambition of Paris over time to make sure that we're able to mitigate the effects of climate change. And so there's much that can be done, I think, in the next round. And this is a critical year, given the conferences that are upcoming. And I think you'll see the U.S. focused on this under John Kerry, to begin to think through, okay, what's the next step of how we're transitioning our economy to reduce our emissions, but also, importantly, how are we doing that with an eye to the opportunities? Because, and you'll see this in the debate over the next big round of spending in the United States, if we are transitioning our electrical grid, if we're investing in new forms of vehicles, if we're investing in energy efficient buildings, that can create so many jobs. That can be a driver of growth as well as a driver of environmental action. But the problem is, if you can't even agree on the fact that climate change is happening, then you have no capacity to solve that problem whatsoever. And Barack Obama used to say this about his differences with Republicans. On most things, if I have one view of how to solve the problem and the other party has a different view, okay, it's incumbent on all of us to get together and hash that out and figure out what can work. But if the people you're sitting down with don't even accept that the sky is blue and that climate change is happening, that the science is real, then there's an impossibility of making progress. And this is not something that should even be up to debate anymore, because we're living with the realities of climate change in our countries right now. So it cannot be overstated the effects that will happen to our national security and our economies if we don't take this seriously. So we need to embrace the consensus. We can debate and discuss how much we need to be investing in new technologies, what types of choices we need to be making, what the private sector's role is here versus the government. But if you don't accept the premise that reality is reality, then you have no hope whatsoever in dealing with this challenge. And we've just lived through 4 years in the United States of what it's like to have a government that doesn't accept objective reality. And we saw in COVID how dangerous that is. And I think that can be seen as a metaphor for climate change itself. In other words, just as the science of COVID was not accepted by the previous administration, they didn't accept the science of climate change. Well, then you obviously can't formulate solutions. So there could not be a more higher stakes issue in my mind to the health, well-being, and even opportunity of our people, because guess what? Other countries are going to be investing in clean energy and in those jobs. So not only do you have an environmental stake in this, you don't want to get beat to the job-creating industries of the future either.
I like the way you say the first step is to acknowledge that we have a serious problem. And until you get to that first step, the rest is not going to follow. But I'm encouraged to see more and more countries doing that. And I'm also encouraged to see countries not take the attitude of, well, I'm not going to act until the next country next door to me acts. We're all now, I think, sufficiently cognizant of the severity of the problem, so everybody is moving forward. Perhaps a question to get an opinion from you on some of the very ambitious things that President Biden has announced in less than 3 months. He has talked about major investments in infrastructure. He has spoken about major investments in tackling climate change, and of course, starting off quite correctly and on major investments to deal with COVID. I would be interested, and I think our viewers would be interested in hearing how is that being received in the United States? How will that? What are the chances of success as it works its way through Congress on all of these very ambitious plans going forward?
Well, I think people have been struck by how overwhelmingly popular and well received a lot of the proposals, almost all the proposals have been. I think there's a sense in the United States, particularly given the lost time of the last 4 years, but also the lost time in many ways of the last 30 years, that it's time to update our infrastructure. It's time to update our social contract by looking after the more vulnerable in our societies and giving them more opportunities. And that there's an enormous amount of possibility that can be unleashed if, once again, the U.S. government is investing in its people. And so if you look at, public opinion polling, these are proposals that are popular not just with Democrats, but with Republicans as well and independents, if you look at the broader population. And there's a sense of excitement, I think, about what can be done if, once again, we're making investments on that type of scale. And again, I think here we have a stake in each other's success, because it's the same kind of economy that Justin Trudeau has sketched out in Canada and that other progressive leaders have sketched out around the world. One that deals with some of these structural challenges that have been a source of so much tension in our domestic politics and in foreign policy generally. Because if you look at the time, particularly since the financial crisis, inequality, a sense that we're falling behind on the climate crisis, a sense that we're falling behind on our basic social contract of providing healthcare and a safety net to the most vulnerable, all of that has been opening the door to these illiberal trends and to obviously the inaction on climate that makes the future seem less hopeful to young people. So I think it's a hopeful time in the United States. And I think the partnership that we can have with Canada and other like-minded democracies and leaders around the world in pursuing the possibilities that are embedded in this large package that's being prepared by the White House and Congress, I think makes it this, an optimistic moment after what is felt at times, particularly to an American, like a pretty difficult few years.
Well, I mean, talking about optimism, I share your optimism, and you strike me as being an optimistic person, and certainly based on all of the comments that you've made tonight. So I have one last question, and it's one of those tough questions, but in the Canada-U.S. relationship as a whole, and you've touched on it quite a bit, but what do you see as the greatest opportunities for us together in the years ahead?
Well, I think, interestingly, everything we've talked about depends upon the U.S. and Canada working together. And I really mean that. The United States has never needed allies more than we do right now, at least not in my lifetime. Countries that share our values, countries that share our priorities. And so when you talk about the need to revitalize democracy, when you talk about the need to manage migration and refugee flows in a way that is both humane and represents our values, but of course takes into account security. When you talk about the need to deal with the climate crisis while creating opportunity for our people as we transition our economies, all of these things are so much easier when the US and Canada are able to look at each other as friends and partners. And the thing that makes me optimistic, Mark, is despite some of the evidence that might try to draw me in other directions, is, I spent a lot of the last few years traveling around the world, in part because, it was nice to get out of the United States from time to time, and get away from our political dramas, but mainly because I wanted to meet people. And I traveled extensively in Canada over the years. And the young people are what made me optimistic. You meet young activists, you meet the young people who are volunteering and participating in the Liberal Party. If I look at, and I've been in conversations that President Obama had with Prime Minister Trudeau about this. My great friend, Katie Telford, who's just an extraordinary chief of staff for the Prime Minister, and I have talked about this, but the energy that young people can bring into politics is the antidote to cynicism, right? And what makes me optimistic is all the things we talked about, young people get it. They get the need to update the social contract. They get the need to deal with climate change. They get the need to promote inclusion and to fight structural racism and injustice, which is obviously such a pressing issue in the United States. They get the need to have democracies that work for everybody in their countries. They're more inclusive, more tolerant, right? And how can we not look at that and be optimistic? And how can we accept outcomes in our politics that fail young people? That would be the greatest tragedy. And when I look about competitions for power in the US or Canada or anywhere in the democratic world, often, the more reactionary and I would say, frankly, right-wing to far-right forces are not capturing the optimism of young people. They're trying to make young people cynical about politics, and they're trying to turn them off. And, well, this will never get solved anyway. We'll never solve climate change anyway. So why don't we just deny that it exists and just keep on doing what we're doing? Well, that's something that's going to make a young person sit out politics rather than get involved. And so the political leaders and parties and movements that we need right now are people that open the door to young people and tap into their optimism, and that also see that we have to have solidarity across borders among progressive parties and center-left parties and people that are trying to actually solve these problems that have been lingering for too long. And that's why I think it's important to have conversations like this. So there's a Canadian flavor to all of these issues that I've talked about, just as there's an American one, just as there's a French one, just as you'll find different perspectives anywhere you look in the world. But if you look at young people around the world, they have more in common with each other than I think their leaders often indicate. And I think Justin Trudeau is the type of leader, and Joe Biden, who recognize that and want political outcomes that speak to the optimism that young people want to have about their future.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for sharing your thoughts with us. I also share your optimism as well. And despite the fact that both our countries are obviously having to go through the pandemic, as is the whole world, and recovering from that, I feel a sense of optimism going forward. And I think both our countries can help each other. And together we can really achieve a great deal. And very, very, very pleased to have had the opportunity, and I'm sure the audience agrees with me, to hear your views as somebody who has been intimately involved with the situation in the United States. So thank you very much for giving us time this evening. It's been a real pleasure to get to know you personally and to hear you. And I know that our audience feels the same way. And if they could applaud and you could hear it, you would hear a loud applause, I'm pretty darn sure. Well, I see some people moving their hands, so that's great. So thank you again, Ben, for joining us at this important Liberal Party convention.
Merci, bonsoir.
Merci.
Well, thank you, Ben and Marc, for this enlightening discussion. It was really great to be able to reflect on Canada's place in the world and the values we share with our American neighbors, and on the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for our democracies. I used to work with Marc in transport, but I think I might have asked him one too many questions about his time in space. I have to say, these last three keynotes have been a really great way to close up our second day. Although I know there are still some regional activities happening tonight, I'm heading to the BC Bash at 6 p.m. as an example, one of the few opportunities where we on the West Coast get to take advantage of our earlier time zone. Tomorrow, of course, there will still be lots of great panels. These include building a fairer and more equitable future, Canadian leadership, from a she session to building back better, and of course, further keynotes from LPC President Suzanne Cowan, and of course, our leader, Justin Trudeau. And a reminder that voting will open tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. and close at 3 p.m. Eastern. I want to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of Rachel and myself and the other co-chairs, Marci and Mona. Thank you for joining us today. We wish you all a great evening. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Good night, everybody.